Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. I'm currently here with Dr. Andrew Loke, and this is a response video to a video by Paulogia. I always forget how to correctly pronounce his YouTube channel name. But the point is that this is a response to a video that he did in response to a video that Dr. Andrew and I recorded. I'm hoping that there's nothing wrong, Andrew, on your end. It looks like we might be having some connection issues. Can you hear me, Andrew? I don't think he can hear me. It looks like we have a lot of buffering going on. Andrew, can you hear me? Testing, testing, testing. Well, that's no good. Okay, I may have to unfortunately end this live stream and try again. Looks like we're having just too many connection issues right now. Let me actually pull up my good news is that because this is live, we can actually edit this afterwards if I can get it worked out in the meantime. Let me see if I can pull up my bandwidth window and see what's going on here. Okay, now Andrew is gone. Guys, let me know if you can hear me. If it seems like there's a lot of buffering going on. I'm hoping that nothing's wrong here on the stream's end.
Oh, hi,
all right,
camera.
Looks like you're back.
Yeah, that's right. Suddenly it went off. I don't know why.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hopefully it stays back, and it looks like we're streaming out. I'm not seeing anything that's saying that we're doing bad here on the internet side of things. Anyways, all right, let's get started. So welcome back to Capturing Christianity. I've got Dr. Andrew Loke with me today. We're doing a response to Paulogia, who produced a response to an interview that I did with Dr. Andrew Loke on the nature of the nature of the hallucinations, the nature of the experiences that the apostles, the first people right after the crucifixion, resurrection of Jesus. If you're a Christian and you believe in the resurrection, we talked about the nature of the appearances of Jesus in that interview. And so Paulogia made a response video to that interview where he basically put Andrew up against other New Testament scholars like Dr. Dale Allison. So I've got like a bug in here that's flying around. Hopefully it's not going to be too distracting today. But so today we are doing a very, very in-depth response to this video that Paulogia put out. And let's just go ahead and dive in. So if you don't know who Andrew is, or Dr. Loke, he is the associate professor in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Hong Kong Baptist University. If you would like to learn more about him, check the link in the description of this video. I've also got links to Paulogia's video. I've got links to my original interview with Dr. Loke. And I've also linked Dr. Loke's book on the resurrection, which was the central sort of focal point of the original interview that I did with him on the nature of the appearances of Jesus, which again is free. So if you haven't downloaded it already, there's literally there's no reason for you not to. It's free. He actually worked out a deal with his I think it was with your college or the university that you're at in order to make this free to everybody, which is just it's amazing. But anyways, definitely go and download it right now. Link, like I said, is in the description of the video. So Andrew, welcome back to the show. Is there anything that you would like to say before we get started here?
Well, I just want to say that, well, it's good to speak to you again. And I find Paulogia's response to our video very interesting, very creative. And I enjoy watching it. And But as I was watching it again, I realized that there's a lot of errors in what he says, misrepresentations, for example. I think there are plenty of them, as I will show later on. And as I was going through the video, I began to realize that, well, if we are going to give a response, it will be about at least 2 hours, I think. Yeah, so I think that it'll be practically impossible for me to have a discussion, which will likely end up in a debate with him, because I think quite a lot of people have been asking, why not you and Paulogia, why not you all have a debate, right? But I think it is practically impossible, because if I were to go through his mistakes in detail, it'll take at least 2 hours. And in the debate, we have to give equal amount of time to both sides. And so if you give me 2 hours, you give him 2 hours, it'll be 4 hours of debate. And I don't have the physical stamina to have a 4 hours debate with him. And that is one reason why I think a response video, right, rather than the debate. And there are other reasons why I do not wish to debate him, but I will mention right at the end of today's session. Yeah. So in the meantime, we can carry on.
Okay. Yeah. So I just wanted to give you guys a heads up on what's going to happen today. So Andrew has actually sent me over a 59 slide presentation that he's going to get through, and all the different things that he wants to say in response to Paulogia's video. So we're going to get to that, but we also have 18 clips from Paulogia's response video queued up, so that we're going to get through those. Andrew's going to give his response, and we're going to work through it sort of systematically. Yeah, I mean, on the point of like, why aren't you just doing a debate with this person? To me, I don't really understand like the pull or the draw of that, because there's benefits and drawbacks to sort of any kind of medium that you produce, whether it's written, whether it's a video, whether it's a debate. There's always going to be limitations. There's always going to be, someone who's doing a debate. Oftentimes there's complaints about like, this isn't rigorous enough, or this isn't really about truth. It's just about like winning points, or like, trying to make your side look better and sort of tribalistic. So there's always things you can say negative about any kind of thing that you do on a subject like this. But in addition to that, there's also different positives. There's positives for doing debates. There's benefits to doing a response like this, where you can be slow and methodical, and there's no interruptions. It's just like, here's one side of it. If you want to get another side of it, then you can go watch something else. So there's benefits, I think, to every kind of interaction that you could have, whether it's like a response like this or a debate. So I just never found that super convincing, that we've got the only way to interact is through a debate. I just never understood that. All right, well, let's get started. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the first clip, and then we'll get to the presentation. Or should I pull up the presentation first? How should we kick this off?
Well, I think you can show the first PowerPoint first.
Okay. So we'll start there, and then just I'm going to rely on you a lot today, Andrew. You've given me all the content, and then you're just going to have to guide me through on how to present it all. So here we go. Here's the presentation slide.
Okay. So let me start by first talking about what Paulogia's hypothesis is, right? What is his own hypothesis concerning the resurrection? Now, he thinks that that only Peter and Paul need to have belief that they had the experience of the resurrected Jesus. I mean, that will be enough, right, to start the belief in the resurrection. That's how everything started. So that is Paulogia's hypothesis. Now, can you play the first video clip now?
Yes. All right, here we go. Here's clip number 1.
Nobody thinks that there were only 2 resurrection appearances, one to Peter and one to Paul. Nobody thinks that.
I do.
Well, I think that is a very interesting clip. I mean, that was not taken from the response video, but that was taken from another video that he made, right, where he interacted with William Lane Craig and other scholars. And when Dr. Craig heard about his hypothesis, Paulogia's hypothesis, Dr. Craig says nobody, right, holds to that view. And Paulogia says I do, right? Now, well, when Dr. Craig says nobody, right, he's not. Obviously in the context he's referring to scholars, people with PhD, right, in the related field, that is in the field related to the study of early Christianity. Say, for example, New Testament studies or history of early Christianity, right? And Dr. Craig is saying that no such scholars hold to that view. And now we know that Paulogia is Paulogia doesn't have a PhD himself. So I want to emphasize at the beginning that Paulogia's own theory is a fringe theory, right, is so fringe that hardly any scholar, I mean, Dr. Craig may have missed out one or two, and I may have missed out one or two, but I think hardly any scholar with a PhD related to the study, to this view, hold to this view. Not even atheists or agnostics scholars, hardly any, right? It's a fringe view. It is even more fringe than young Earth creationism. Now, I want to point out this right at the beginning because I think that this is very interesting because I have seen some other videos by Paulogia. I've not seen everything, but I've seen some of them. And from my understanding is that there's one video which Paulogia says Ken Ham, the young Earth creationist, like, make me an atheist. Paulogia used to hold to young Earth creationism himself, and then once he thought that that is debunked, he thought that that started him rolling down, right? And he eventually became a non-Christian. And so so he rejected young Earth creationism because he came to realize that that is a fringe theory. Hardly any scientists hold to that view. It's not scientifically credible. But then young Earth creationism at least has tens of scientists with PhDs, according to my understanding. I mean, they may have claimed even more than that, but I think there are at least tens of them. But for Paulogia's own theory, only two people who believe they have experience, hardly any scholars, right, with PhD hold to that theory. So it is even more fringe, than the theory, that led Paulogia to reject Christianity. So I thought that it's very astonishing that Paulogia actually moved from one fringe theory to an even more fringe theory, right, when he became a non-Christian. So in order, right, to avoid the resurrection, right, in order to not believe the resurrection, he actually embraced an even more fringe theory compared to young Earth creationism. So I thought that is quite astonishing.
I also want to say that he's been pretty apparent that, or transparent, that one of the reasons why he's espousing this view that there's only only two people believed that they had experienced the risen Jesus is because then you don't have to worry about group hallucinations. Like, it seems almost like it's kind of working backwards. Like, he sees the trouble with group hallucinations, and this is kind of pushing him down this road of denying that there are any group hallucinations.
Well, we pointed out the problems with group hallucination, right, in our previous video, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, everybody does,
right.
And it's really, really terrible theory. So, all right, let's should we move on to the next slide here?
Please do. Move on. So I'm going to point out a number of problems. Why is a fringe theory? Why hardly any scholars hold to that view, right? And I'm going to point out the methodological problems, and then his misinterpretation of primary sources, his misunderstandings of and his misrepresentation of scholars, and his use of false analogies. Right. So in the process of pointing out the errors with his theory, I will defend my own view against his objection. Right. And so I'm going to defend the view that there are groups of people, right, who claim to have experience of the resurrected Jesus. So that is what I'm going to argue for, right? So Paulogia argues for only two, but I'm going to argue that there are groups, right? So in the process of pointing out the errors with his theory, I will defend my view, which is held by many scholars, against his objections. So that's what we'll be doing for today.
All right, and here's the next slide.
Next slide. Okay, so let me first point out some methodological problems with Paulogia's view. And we may call this ground rules, right? So, after the debate with Graham Opie, right, we have been talking about ground rules. So I think it's important, right, to talk about ground rules first. And these ground rules are important because these are the methodological reasons that led Paulogia, right, to reject the view that there were groups of people, right? So it's important to address this issue first. Now, there are two important issues. So first of all is Paulogia's objection concerning the lack of outside Bible corroboration, right? And he calls this the "for the Bible tells me so" objection, right? He says that, well, you Christians only have your Bible as a source, right? So what, there's lack of outside Bible corroboration for the resurrection appearances, for example, for some details of the resurrection appearances, right? And so this is his first methodological objection, and his second methodological objection is the lack of first-hand sources, right? So later on, I will show how he used this as objection, right? When I gave my arguments, he said, well, that's just an inference, that's not a first-hand eyewitness source. So he keep coming back to this again and again, right? The lack of outside external biblical corroboration and the lack of first-hand sources. So let me address these two methodological issues first. Now, I have a number of points in my response, so let me go through one by one. The first point is a relatively minor one, and is back to the previous slide.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. So the first point is a minor point, which is that there is no New Testament Bible as we know it today when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, for example. So instead of using the word Bible, which is convenient, I mean, sometimes I use it myself, but it's actually anachronistic, right? So it's better, it's more precise to use the word ancient Christian source. Forget about the Bible, right? Because there is no Bible as we know it during that time, right? There are letters, there are biographies. So the letters of Paul are letters, and this is an ancient Christian source, right? And then the Gospels, scholars have studied the genre of the Gospels, so you can look at the works of Craig Keener, and Richard Burridge, for example. They have argued that the Gospels are ancient biographies. So so these are ancient Christian source. So forget about the Bible, right? Let's call this ancient Christian source, all right? So this is the first point. Now, the second point I want to point out is that looking for outside, there is ancient non-Christian written sources for corroboration, and more first-hand written sources may be difficult under certain circumstances. Okay, so Paulogia is looking for these, right? External sources, ancient non-Christian sources, and he want more of these. He want more first-hand sources. But I want to point out that looking for more of these may be difficult under certain circumstances. Next slide, please. So let me say first about why the lack of non-Christian ancient written sources corroborating the resurrection of Jesus. Now, the first point is that relatively fewer people were writing during that time compared to today. So it's not like today, when we have lots of people writing lots of things, right? So there are newspaper reports, different kinds of medias, right, that report the news. But it wasn't like this in the first century, right? I mean, there's simply fewer people who were writing, and so we can talk about the Roman Greco-Roman historians and the Jewish historians, right? Now, concerning the Greco-Roman historians, their primary interest was Rome. What happens in Rome and incidents that relate to Rome, such as revolts in the provinces, wars on the borders, or the moral antics of emperors, and that dominated political gossip. Right? So this is what the Roman historians were more interested to write about. Right? So they don't just write about everything, right? But they are quite focused in their interests. Right? They focus on certain topics. So given that this is the case, one crucified sage or rebel in a minor Asian province in Palestine will invite little attention from the Roman historians until a few decades later, his followers become public news in the Roman capital itself. All right, so we know that later on, the Christians became public news when Nero blamed them for the fire in Rome. Right, so that's when they become public news, but that happened a bit later, slightly later on, right? And this was reported later by Tacitus. So I took this right from Keener's Christo biography, right? So that's a citation. So we need to understand what are given the interests of the Roman historians, we shouldn't expect that many of them, right, will be writing about Jesus. And the other point then. The point is that, well, we know that Tacitus said something about Jesus. He mentioned that Tacitus mentioned that Jesus suffered the extreme penalty. which of course is referring to the crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. However, it's interesting to note that Tacitus dismissed Christianity as a most mischievous superstition. He didn't discuss the claims of Jesus' resurrection. He didn't discuss the claims of the resurrection appearances. He just say, well, this is just a superstition. And again, this is not surprising. For example, today when we look at people who have been commenting on YouTube, right? I saw Paulogia's video. I saw some of the comments on YouTube. Many people will just dismiss the resurrection. They will say, well, how can people believe in such a thing? This is ridiculous. How can this Andrew Loke? He has a PhD and he believes the resurrection, right? So people are just dismissing it, without even considering the evidence or the arguments that I present, right? Quite a lot of people, right, do that, right? So they are just skeptics, who are very dismissive. And well, these skeptics are found in the ancient world too. So we shouldn't think of people in the ancient world as very gullible. There are gullible around. There are gullible people around during that time. As even today, there are also gullible people around, right? But there are also skeptics around in the ancient world, and many of these ancient historians, Tacitus, right? He will just dismiss this, and so this is another reason why. So given that there are fewer people writing, that the primary interest will not be on Palestine, and and the people are, and even when they write about Palestine, they can be quite dismissive. So given all this, it's not surprising, right, that we won't be finding that we will have the lack of non-Christian ancient sources corroborating the resurrection of Jesus. Okay, next slide, please. Now, what about the Jewish? On the Jewish side, James Cullerton Paget, who is a scholar at Cambridge University, he said that we know from subsequent history that Jewish writers were in the main unwilling to engage polemically with Christianity in their extant writings. Now, it's not that they totally disregard Christianity, but they in the main they don't write very much about it, right? And one reason. Paget go on to say that it will be wrong to assume that such people simply knew nothing about Christianity or that they were unacquainted with Christians. Their silence could have been illustrative of their contempt for or embarrassment about Christianity rather than their ignorance. So Paget is saying that some people choose not to write about Christianity because they just don't like Christianity. They don't like to talk about it. Or it could be due to their embarrassment. It could be that they don't know how to respond to their arguments, for example. So it's interesting, for example, that when we read the Gospel of Matthew, we find that there is an early tradition that says that the Jews claim that the Christian disciples stole Jesus' body. And we also find this in Justin Martyr, in the early 2nd century, right? Justin Martyr, in his dialogue with Trypho, which is a dialogue with a Jew, he also mentioned this story that is found among the Jews, that the Jews claim that Jesus' disciples stole Jesus' body. But we don't find this in the Jewish sources itself, right? It's not found in the written sources. So it could be an oral. It could be something that the Jews were talking about, but it's not written in the Jewish source. And one reason why the Jewish source don't write about it, it could be due to their embarrassment about Christianity. Obviously the Christians will be refuting their claims, right? And the Christians will be arguing that, well, it is implausible to think that the disciples will be willing to steal, will have the courage and even the ability, right, to steal Jesus' body and be willing to sacrifice their lives for what they knew is false, right? Arguments like this. We know that early church fathers, right, also used the argument that the early Christians were willing to sacrifice their lives, right, as an argument that it was not a hoax. Now, anyway, this is a side issue. We will discuss the sacrifice argument later on. But at this point in time, I just want to point out that it could be due to their embarrassment. It could be that they have no good response, right, to the Christian argument, and that's why they chose not to write about it. And and that's why they can they just say this but then they don't write it down. So it could be due to their contempt or their embarrassment rather than their ignorance. So we must be careful to note here that what we have in the written source is only the tip of the iceberg, right? A lot of things were being said, but they may not be written down, right? So that is an important point. Okay, next slide, please. So so there are numerous reasons why there is a lack of non-Christian ancient written sources corroborating the resurrection of Jesus. It could be that certain non-Christian ancient authors might have thought that they could not explain away the claim of Jesus' resurrection convincingly, and thus they chose not to write about them. Now, there are some who chose to write about them. So, for example, the 2nd century Celsus, he is a very well-known critic of Christianity. Now, he thought that he could explain away Jesus' resurrection, and that's why he chose to write about them.
I can see if he comes back in. All right, looks like you're back.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I think, there's been some disruptions.
Yeah, no worries. All right, continue.
Okay, so now I'm not saying whether these are good arguments. I'm not saying whether the hallucination argument or the stolen body arguments. I'm not weighing these arguments right now, right? I mean, I've already done so elsewhere in my book and elsewhere. But at this moment in time, I just want to emphasize that different people have different reasons for writing, right? The ancient authors. So some may choose not to write because of various reasons, and some may choose to write because of various reasons. And in any case, we still need to consider the writings which we do have, okay? And that's the main point. So, for Tacitus, for example, Tacitus would just dismiss Christianity as a superstition. So many at that time would have as superstition. I mean, Tacitus didn't mention Jesus' resurrection, but he just dismissed Christianity as a whole, as a superstition. However, it's interesting that there were others who believed and wrote about it. So we know that Paul and Luke, for example, right? These were not the initial disciples. These were not insiders at the beginning, right? They only believed later on. Given that Paul and Luke were convinced that Jesus resurrected and they converted, they become Christians, their writings would of course be ancient Christian source, right? What do you expect? So so my point is that for there are various reasons why the non-Christians, ancient writers, why many of them do want to write about Christianity, but there are also reasons that for those who are convinced, they become Christians, and that's no wonder why their writings would be ancient Christian source, right? And that's why and all this explain why there is a lack of non-Christian ancient written sources. So the point here is that the crucial question that needs to be answered is, what are the reasons that compelled the earliest Christians, including the original disciples and also outsiders, right? Like Paul and Luke, for example. What is it that compelled them to believe, to be convinced that Jesus resurrected, and to declare and to proclaim that he resurrected, right? So that is the key question that needs to be answered, regardless of how much non-Christian ancient written sources we have, right? So we still need to address this key question. Okay, next slide, please. Now, what about the lack of first-hand eyewitness sources? Now, is Paul the only first-hand source? Actually, Matthew and John cannot be so easily dismissed. Now, Paulogia thinks that Matthew and John are not written by Matthew and John, right? He cites some scholars for that view. However, the authorship of Matthew and John, I mean, the traditional authorship cannot be so easily dismissed. Now, this is a huge topic. I don't have time to go into details, but I would refer listeners to the works of the great German scholar Martin Hengel and Craig Keener, the American scholar Craig Keener. So they have argued quite convincingly, in my view, that there are good reasons to think that Matthew was written by Matthew, who was one of the 12, and John was written by the Apostle John, who was also one of the 12. Now, so for example, I can't go into this in detail, but I just want to share very briefly. So for example, Martin Hengel argues that the Gospels were not written to strangers, right? It's not something that is written and sent to strangers. It was written and it was written for a faith community, right? It was written for a Christian community, and the Christian community would have known who the author was. And it's just like today, if you just read my WhatsApp messages, right? My WhatsApp messages, most of them are anonymous, right? I don't usually write. So for example, when I send a message to my wife, I don't write. I don't sign off as Andrew Loke, right? I don't, right? Why? Because my wife, on the receiving end of those WhatsApp messages, she will know that this message come from me, right? So I don't have to put my name right on top of my message. You see what I mean, right? And that's why if you just look at the message itself, it is anonymous. And likewise, when we look at the Gospels, right, they are anonymous. The content, right, of the documents are anonymous. Why? Because they were sent to known people. They were not sent to strangers. So the recipients of the Gospels would have known who the author were. And it is important to note that there is no counter traditions to the traditional authorship. So for example, right, Matthew, from the tradition we have, it is the tradition ascribed to Matthew, and there are no counter traditions. There's not another tradition saying that it was not Matthew, it was Andrew or whoever else. That there is no such counter tradition. So Martin Hengel argues that it must have been known, right, by the audience from very early on that it was Matthew, such that, right, because otherwise, if it's something that is added in much later, there'll be counter traditions, right? So some people may add this, some people may think that it's otherwise, or people who know the original author, the original recipient group, right? They will have said, well, it's not Matthew, right? It was somebody else. They will have protested against, right, the description of Matthew, right? So if the original group of people know that it wasn't Matthew, they will have come up with a counter tradition, right? They will have come up with an alternative author. Say Andrew or whoever else, right, rather than Matthew. But we see none of this, right? So the church tradition were in uniform agreement that it was Matthew, right? And there was no hint of any alternative suggested. So Martin Hengel used this as an argument, right? And to argue for the traditional authorship, and there are other arguments which Keener provided as well. So what I want to say is that the Matthew and John cannot be so easily dismissed, right, as first-hand sources, and neither can the claim that all four Gospels have basis in first-hand eyewitness testimonies. Now, again, I don't have time to go through this in detail, but you can see Craig Keener's book Christobiography, where he argues at length for this. Basically, that given the genre of the Gospels, written during the time of living memory, there is people who have known the apostles or the apostles. So that's what I mean. That's what is meant by living memory. So in that context, a genre that's written in that context will be expected, right, to be based on eyewitness testimony. I think that's the argument that Keener provides in great detail. So if you're interested, you can look at this his book Christobiography for details of the arguments, right? So this is the first point. Now, the second point is that the relative rarity of written first-hand sources is to be expected, given that few people at the time could write well, right? As I mentioned earlier on, not many people were writing relatively compared to today. It was mostly an oral culture. And so given that this is the case, not having more first-hand written sources does not imply that other apostles were not proclaiming. Obviously, they are proclaiming orally, right? But they are not. So the fact that they are not writing their own first-hand sources doesn't mean that they are not telling the story about Jesus, right? So again, I want to emphasize that written first-hand sources may just be the tip of the iceberg. And so we have to look at other considerations. And this is an important point. Okay, next slide, please. And I want to emphasize that it is not the case that we only have 1 Corinthians and nothing else. Now, because 1 Corinthians was written within a context that is well established by other evidence. So, for example, we have ancient non-Christian sources from Josephus, Pliny, Tacitus, corroborating the fact that Christians existed in the 1st century. Okay, I'm talking about Christians, right? No, there were Christians. No, there were this group of people existing in the 1st century, and that it was also mentioned that they were persecuted. So, for example, Tacitus referred to the persecution of Christians, for example, and Pliny as well. And we also have various sources. For example, the citations of 1 Corinthians by early church fathers, indicating that 1 Corinthians was regarded by early Christians to be a very important document, which reveal a lot about what they actually believe. Okay, so 1 Corinthians is not just kind of fringe letter among Christians. No, 1 Corinthians was cited quite often by the early church fathers. So this shows that it was a highly respected letter among Christians. It is a very important document for early Christians. And we also have ancient biographies I mentioned, the 4 Gospels. For the historical reliability of the first 4 Gospels, you can check out Keener's books. And the early Christian writings, so the writings of by the church fathers, for example, 1 Clement, dating from the period of living memory, that is the period from the 1st to early 2nd century, within which people who could have known the so-called eyewitnesses, right, the 12, for example, right, people who could have known them were still alive. And for details, you can check out the work of Marcus Bockmuir, who is a professor at Oxford University. Right, he argues for this point. So in conclusion, the early documents. So there were early documents written when people who involved could verify, or falsify, right? About the claims concerning whether these eyewitnesses, whether they exist or not, right? It was written within the period of living memory, and it was within a context which is well corroborated, right? The context being that we also have we know that there were Christians around, and we know that they were persecuted, for example. Okay, so it's important to bear in mind the context when we discuss further. Okay, next slide, please. Now, the third point, so I already mentioned 2 points, right? The first point is that we should forget about the word Bible, and we should talk about ancient Christian source. And the second point is that I have already explained why looking for more external non-Christian corroboration and more first-hand source, why that may be difficult under the circumstances. And the third point I want to highlight is that looking for ancient non-Christian source for corroboration and first-hand sources is not the only way to determine the truthfulness of Christian source. Okay, so this is an important point. Because Paulogia seems to keep assuming that I have to have first-hand source, or I have to have external corroboration before I can accept something as true. He seems to hold very strongly. He thinks that this is a high standard which he needs to hold on to, that he needs to stick with. But actually, there is no proof that this is the only standard, right? There's no proof that this is the only way to determine the truthfulness of the Christian source. In fact, on the contrary, the use of various considerations, hypothesis, and inference to explain the data is another way, and these are widely used by historians as well. In fact, even if we find corroboration in non-Christian sources, even if there are many non-Christian sources corroborating, we will still need to depend on various considerations to rule out the possibility that both Christian and non-Christian sources got it wrong, right? I mean, so what if you have non-Christian corroboration? I mean, it could still be that both Christian and non-Christian got it wrong, right? I mean, that is still a possibility. So you still need to use other considerations and other inference, right, to rule out the possibility that to show that it is unlikely that both Christian and non-Christian got it wrong, right? So, for example, I mentioned just now about the existence of Christians in the first century. This is mentioned in Christian source. This is also mentioned in ancient non-Christian source, right? This is corroborated in Pliny, Tacitus, Josephus. They all mention about Christians in the first century. Now, it is unlikely that they got it wrong. It's unlikely that both Christian and non-Christian sources got it wrong because they were appealing to public knowledge. And this public knowledge could easily be verified by the readers, right? So it's unlikely that both got it wrong, right? Because this is public knowledge which can easily be checked, right, by the readers. Now, of course, this is a good inference. I know it is unreasonable to think that both sides got it wrong in this case. But notice that this is an inference, right? This is an inference, right? You still need inference, right, to argue for why it is unlikely that both got it wrong. So that's my point, right? So the point here is that inference cannot be avoided. Next slide, please. Next. So I already mentioned this already, right? Paulogia replied to a number of important arguments by rejecting inference. He said that Paul wouldn't have cared to pass on accurate information. Well, that was my argument, right? He just replied by saying, oh, that's just an inference. He just dismissed it by saying that that's an inference. I mean, he replied to my argument by saying that that is just an inference. And then he argued against my inference that the 1200 saw Jesus because he claimed that because we don't have first-hand accounts from the 12 or somebody from the 500, he said we don't have the first-hand account, so that is just an inference. So he just dismissed that. And so that highlights that his underlying methodology, right, is that he replied to a number of important arguments by rejecting inference. But my response is to say that that is his assumption, his methodological assumption is wrong, right? He cannot just dismiss an inference like that because inference is important, as I said earlier on, right? All kinds of historical reasoning will involve inference, even if you have first-hand source, even if you have external corroboration, you will still need inference, right? Next slide, please. As Mike Licona points out, right? Since we have no direct access to the past, all ancient history is known to varying degrees through inference, right? That's the point that I was trying to make. So what is an inference? An inference is a conclusion reached on the basis of evidence and reasoning, right? So that's an inference. So, for example, how does Paulogia know that Paul was giving a first-hand account? I mean, Paulogia he acknowledged that Paul was writing. Paul was the author of 1 Corinthians, right? Paulogia admit that this is true. But how do we know that? I mean, that is also true inference. So how do we know that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, for example? I mean, so Paul say that it is written on the letter, Paul wrote this, but how do we know that it's true, right? How do we know that it was not a forgery, somebody forging in the name of Paul? So again, you will need inference, right, to argue against that, right? That so Paulogia may argue that, well, because we have first-hand accounts of early church fathers who knew Paul, so First Clement refers to Paul as the author of 1 Corinthians, etc., and the audience would have known. And I agree that's true, right? The recipients of the letters, right, they will have ways to check out that it was from Paul because Paul was still supposed to be alive during that time when 1 Corinthians was written. So so Paul was writing. So the 1 Corinthians was written to a known audience, right? And so they will be able to verify that it was indeed from Paul. And also we have other external testimony that it was from Paul. But notice that all this is inference, right? I mean, it's unlikely that they're all mistaken. I mean, that's true, but that is an inference. So we will still need inference, right? That is unavoidable. Now, inference can be highly reliable, right? And so, for example, if somebody says, we don't know if the apostles, whether they peed or pooped, right? We don't know whether they go to the toilet or not because there's no first-hand account. As far as I know, there's no first-hand account that says that, I, Andrew, I'm an apostle, I went to toilet. I mean, we don't have such a first-hand source. But does it mean that we don't know that they will need to go to toilet? I mean, that will be dumb, right? If you say that, oh, that's just an inference, that that they need to pee and poo, right? That's just an inference. If somebody just dismiss it as an inference, I would say that no, that guy needs to be dismissed, right, as being dumb, right? I mean, this is such an inference is as reliable as any first-hand account, right? Because, well, given the lack of any context or evidence to suggest a miracle in this case, right? To think that they somehow miraculously don't need to pee and poo. I mean, there's no evidence. There's no people claiming to see that they didn't pee and poo. Given that there's no evidence of a miracle in this case, there's no context for miracle in this case, right? We will just assume that. We will just infer that Andrew and the other apostles, right? They were normal people, right? They need to eat, drink, and they need to pee and poo. Right, so even if we don't have any first-hand account that they pee and poo, but we can infer that they must have, they must have done that, right? So if anybody dismisses as an inference, I think that would be dumb. Okay,
so
next.
I think you need to write an article called the argument from pee and poo for the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah, I think that will be an interesting article, and I hope there'll be as many people reading it as much as there are many people watching Paulogia.
All right, next slide.
Yeah, that will catch a lot of attention. Okay, so in conclusion, regarding methodology, so these are the ground rules. Now, corroboration from non-Christian source and first-hand account are not the only ways to determine the truthfulness of a Christian source. In fact, the value of these are based on inference and considerations. So the views of various considerations, hypothesis, inference to explain the data is another way to determine the truthfulness of the Christian source. It is in fact more foundational than other ways, and it can be highly reliable as well. In fact, Paulogia himself used it in some ways, right? Even though he might not explicitly acknowledge it, but when he acknowledged certain historical facts, such as, for example, that Paul was the author of 1 Corinthians, he agreed with that, right? He agreed that there were Christians in the first century, and he agreed that both Christians and non-Christians got it right. No, he still he will require inference along the way, right? To arrive at a conclusion. So the use of inference is can be highly reliable, right? It depends on the validity, the quality of the evidence of the inference, supporting the inference. And therefore, Paulogia should not simply dismiss an inference by simply saying that there is no non-Christian corroboration or there's no first-hand source. He shouldn't just dismiss an inference like that, right? Rather, he should consider the evidence for the inference. He should consider the reasoning of the inference. He shouldn't just dismiss an inference like that. And I also have already explained, since there may be reasons why there is a lack of non-Christian corroboration of first-hand sources, right? I already explained the reasons why there may be why there may be a lack of such sources. And so at the end of the day, we still need to consider what we have, and we still need to consider inference. And that is the important point which I want to emphasize. Okay, so I already spoken quite a lot on these methodological issues. And by the way, today, are there any live audience?
Yes. Yeah, we have about 200 currently watching.
Okay, next slide, please. So I think I would like to just pause for a while and to ask whether are there any questions about the methodological aspect before I go on. Are there any questions from people that you see? Because I can't see any. I'm not looking at the chat right now. So are there any questions that you would like to raise about what I have discussed so far, Cameron?
Personally, no. I've just been following along. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to point out that like requiring first-hand accounts, it's not always. I mean, the term that I'm looking for is reasonable. It's not always reasonable to expect first-hand accounts of these sort of ancient historical, questions. You've got to do what you can with the material that you've got, and in some cases, the material is good enough to warrant belief in whatever historical fact. Even if you don't have these extra sources that would be nice to have if you could have them, but you know, like you say, the question of whether or not there are other sources, if we do have additional sources, that's a separate question from like what kind of reasonable inferences can we make from the data that we do currently have. I think those are two distinct questions. And just to assume that you can't make an inference, a reasonable inference, you know, you could think about it in whatever kind of methodological framework that you want, whether it's Bayesian or inductive or whatever. You still got to do something with the data that you've got, and in order to block that kind of inference, you've got to do the work of actually blocking it, as opposed to just assuming that you've got to have these additional sources. I mean, it could be the case that without these additional sources, there is still ample reason to believe that, you know, Caesar crossed the Rubicon. I agree with you. I think that's an unreasonable sort of standard and historical methodology.
Yeah, so I think for the case of Caesar crossing the Rubicon, I think Paulogia may say that, well, we do have a first-hand source. I mean, you have some writings from Caesar himself, it seems, that he crossed the Rubicon. But anyway, that's another issue. But the point here is that, yes, even if we don't have first-hand source, right, but if we have other evidence on the basis of which, you know, we can provide a reasonable inference, then that needs to be taken into account of, right? We cannot just simply dismiss it as an inference, as what Paulogia did in response to my arguments. So that is important.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think this was, if you watch the video, it was about, Dale Allison was really the one who was sort of painting this dichotomy. Let me pull up my interview scene so that everyone can see both of us. Dale Allison was the one who was sort of painting this dichotomy between like something that's, he didn't put it in these terms, but like an inference on the one hand and like a firsthand account or like an eyewitness report or something like that. And like, that's what you need, is you need some kind of like firsthand eyewitness account. And otherwise you're just making an inference. And then, so the dichotomy is you've either got something that's good or you got something that's bad, and what's bad is an inference. But that to me is just, it's more rhetorical, because an inference can still be a completely reasonable way of coming to some conclusion. So calling it an inference doesn't do anything in my mind. I mean, we make inferences all the time. Like you pointed out with the pee and poo example, there are completely reasonable inferences that can be made even from the sources that we've got, even if we don't have any extra non-Christian sources. So yeah, I mean, yeah.
Let me add something about Dale Allison. It's very interesting you mentioned this point. Actually, I was about to say that too. Okay, now about Dale Allison, it's very interesting to note that he doesn't dismiss inference totally. I mean, there are some parts in the talk where he seems to say that, in response to Mike Licona, he just said, you know, that there is an inference. However, there are other conclusions which he reached on the basis of inference. So, for example, Dale Allison, in his video, he argues that no, there are a few things which we can know about Christianity. One of which is that the proclamation of Jesus' resurrection, Dale Allison thinks that start from the very beginning of Christianity. You know, he called it day one, right? Dale Allison says that. However, we don't have any first-hand accounts of that. I mean, because Dale Allison, remember, Dale Allison doesn't believe that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were first-hand sources. He thinks that we only have Paul. But then Paul wasn't there at the beginning of Christianity, right? Paul was a late comer, so to speak. You know, Paul only converted a while later. So we don't have any direct first-hand source from any of the 12, according to Dale Allison, that the resurrection was proclaimed from day one of Christianity, right at the beginning, before Paul was converted. We don't have that first-hand source. We don't have external corroboration, non-Christian corroboration of that as well. That it was from day one, from the beginning. And yet, Dale Allison argues that we can know that is true, right? He based it on inference, right? He argues from 1 Corinthians 15, which he agrees is a very early tradition that Paul received from somebody who came before, who was a Christian before Paul. And in fact, most scholars accept that conclusion, right? 1 Corinthians 15 is a very early tradition. that reflects what Christians believe from day one. From day one, from what Dale Ellison called day one of Christianity. I mean, he called it day one. So so Dale Ellison arrived at that conclusion based on inference. So Dale Ellison is not totally dismissing all inference, but he's just qualifying what Mike Licona was saying, right? When Mike Licona argues about certain details of the resurrection appearances. Say, for example, like Mike Licona was arguing about the disciples having meals with Jesus, for example, and then Dale Ellison raised some objections about that, and he just say that there's an inference in response to Mike Licona. That's about certain details. But now, concerning those details, I'm not arguing those at the moment. I mean, we can talk about that later on. I will talk about that later on. But at this point in time, I just want to highlight that actually, if you read carefully what Dale Ellison actually writes, he also arrives at some conclusions which he thinks is pretty certain based on inference.
All right, so where should we go from here? Should I pull back up the presentation?
Oh, yes, please do.
Okay. So here's the next slide. There you go.
Okay. So earlier on, I have already argued that we need to consider the data and we need to consider inference. So what is the data that we need to consider? Well, 1 Corinthians 15, this is an important data. And I already talked about this right in our previous interview. Right? Mentioned that this is written before 1855, in which Paul says that Christ died for sins of people, and he was buried, and he raised on the third day, and then he appeared to Peter, 12, and then after that to more than 500 people at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. And then he appeared to James and the apostles, right? So this is what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, and this is an important data which we will need to consider. Okay, next slide. So given that, so what are the possible explanations for this data, right? I mentioned earlier on, we need to consider the data, we need to consider what are the hypotheses, and we need to consider the inference, right? So what are the possible hypotheses? Now, in my book, I demonstrated that there are only these few possibilities. Either there were no groups of people who claimed that they saw the bodily resurrected Jesus. I mean, this was a legend. Paul was passing on a legend. Or there were such people, right? Either there were no groups. So I'm focusing on groups here, right? Because that is the key point of contention between me and Paulogia. Paulogia denied that there were groups of people. So I'm arguing that either there were no groups of people or there were. And if there were groups of people who claim they saw the bodily resurrected Jesus, if there were such people, either they didn't see anything, no experience theory, or at least some, if not all of them, saw something. Now, if at least some or if not all of them did see something, did experience something, then either their experience were caused intramentally. So this is an intramental hypothesis, which include hallucinations or hysteria or delusion, false memories, right? So these are intramental, or they were caused extramentally, right? So there was somebody there whom they actually saw. So if there was somebody there whom they actually saw, that either they misidentified that somebody else as the bodily living Jesus, maybe it wasn't Jesus, maybe it was somebody else, or it was Jesus whom they saw bodily alive. Now, if it was Jesus, then either Jesus didn't die on the cross earlier, so it could be that he escaped. Right? Maybe he wasn't crucified. They crucified the wrong guy, and then Jesus ran away and then came out again a few days later and say, "Hey guys, I'm alive." Right? Or Jesus was crucified, but he didn't die on the cross. He just fainted on the cross, the Sun theory. And then 3 days later, he recovered, pushed away the stone somehow, right? Escaped from the tomb, and then tell people, "Hey guys, I'm alive," right? Sun theory. So either Jesus didn't die on the cross earlier, or Jesus did die on the cross. Now, if Jesus did die on the cross earlier, then what the disciples saw was the Jesus who was dead earlier and then was seen bodily alive, which means that they saw the bodily resurrected Jesus, right? Which means that Jesus actually resurrected. So if we think about the case for the resurrection logically, we find that these are the only possibilities. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Before that. I thought I had one extra slide. I'm sorry. So let me go back to this. Right. So there are only these few possibilities. So either it was a legend, or it was no experience, or it was an intramental hypothesis, right? Or it was misidentification, or it was escape. Jesus wasn't crucified, or it was soon, he just fainted on the cross, or Jesus actually resurrected. Now, I address all these hypotheses in my book. I refuted all the naturalistic alternatives, but I don't have time to talk about all of them today. I have already talked about some of them in our previous interview, in our previous session with you, Cameron, right? So we have talked about hallucination, for example. So for today, I just want to focus on the first two, which I highlight in yellow, because that is the main point of contention between me and Paulogia, right? Whether there were groups of people who experienced something or not. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the first 2 points. Okay. Now, why do I think that there were groups of people? Why do most scholars think that there were more than 2 people? Now, there are a number of reasons, right? So it is a cumulative case. And it's important to point this out because now, just now I mentioned that inference, right? I mean, there are different kinds of inference. You know, some inference may be good, some inference may be bad. A good inference can be highly reliable, as I mentioned earlier on, right? In fact, all history requires inference at some point. And so one characteristic of a good inference will be an inference that is based on a cumulative case inference, where we have multiple considerations supporting the conclusions, right? So a cumulative inference is a very powerful one. And in fact, that is the reason why most scholars hold to the view that there were numerous people, right? Who it was not just 2 people, right? Who had the experience. That's the reason why Paulogia's view is rejected by most historians, because there is a very good inference, which can be provided to show that there were multiple people, right? There were groups of people, in fact, who had the experience. And so I summarize the reasons which scholars have provided and also added some additional ones of my own, right? And I mentioned in our previous talk that there were 6 reasons, right? But actually, when I analyzed them more carefully, actually there were more than 6, right? So I'm going to divide them into at least 8 today. Okay, so at least 8 considerations that provides a cumulative case to arrive at the conclusion that there were groups of people who had the experience. So the first 3 considerations shows that it is likely that the early Christians would check whether there were indeed groups of people who claim to have experienced Jesus or not, right? That the early Christians would check. So the First Corinthians would check, for example. It is likely. Why? Because firstly, many ancient people were highly skeptical of bodily resurrection, right? So it's not something that people will have believed easily. Certainly, many non-Christians during that time would find it difficult to believe, and even for Christians, some of them will have doubts as well about this. Even after people converted, they can still have doubts, right? I mean, we know that Christians have doubts sometimes. Even I myself have doubts sometimes, right? So after people may have believed, but they may still, on reflection, they may still have doubts, right? So so for Christians, even for Christians at the time, it wasn't something easy to believe, as we will see later on when we read First Corinthians in detail. I will talk about this point later. But let me just outline the points first. I will talk about each point in detail, right, as we go along. So so the outline is that, firstly, it is not something that is easy for ancient people to believe. Many ancient people will find it difficult to believe. And secondly, this is an important matter, right? This is not something that people can just, I believe, never mind, it's okay. No, it is a foundational, right, to their faith, and it is a faith that the early Christians were willing to sacrifice for, right? Were willing to die for. And at this point, I emphasize on willingness, right? I mean, I'll talk about the so-called martyrdom argument later on, right? I will respond to Paulogia. I will discuss that argument later on. But at this point in time, I just want to outline the argument first, right? So given points 1, 2, and 3, it's very likely that the early Christians, including the readers of First Corinthians, they will want to check, they want to find out whether is it really true, right? There were groups of people who that they want to check out whether what Paul says is true or not. I mean, Paul is claiming that there were groups of people who claim to have seen, who claim that Jesus appeared to them, and these people would want to find out, given that it's not something easy to believe, and given that this is such an important matter, that they are supposed to be willing to sacrifice for this. I mean, at least that's what Paul is telling them, right? That this is something that Christians should be willing to die for. I mean, Paul told them quite explicitly in 1 Corinthians 15 that we face death every day, right, for this. So these first 3 points, and so people would the first points indicate that people would likely be wanting to find out, and then the fourth point says that people could find out, right? So not only that they would, it's likely that they would want to find out, they could check out if there were indeed such groups, and I will explain why later on. And the fifth consideration is that Paul assumed responsibility and cared for his reputation with his known audience, right? So it's not something that Paul can just throw out a lie and it doesn't matter. No, this is something that is serious, because Paul cares about how the Corinthians think about his credibility, and the cost of false confirmation would have been very high for Paul. And the sixth consideration, which is that the Corinthians knew at least some, if not all, of the eyewitnesses. There's indication of that in the letter itself, that Corinthians knew at least some of them. And Paul was appealing to public knowledge, which people know. And the third and the seventh point is that other early documents also claim Jesus' resurrection and group appearances. And the eighth point is solid evidence involving groups who have been required to generate widespread belief of bodily resurrection among the early Christians in the first place. Okay, so let me go through these 8 points in detail now. Okay, next slide. Okay, now before that, Paulogia. Okay, can you? I think. Okay, so before that, now Paulogia mentioned something. He said that the historical fact. I think there's a clip to be played here. If I'm not wrong, can you play the clip? Yeah.
The second clip.
Yep.
Yep. All right, I've got it queued up. Let me go ahead and play it, and then we'll come back to the presentation. Here we go.
There are 6 considerations for thinking that what Paul's saying is true, right? They were indeed these people, and that these people did claim and did experience something which they thought was the resurrected Jesus. Okay.
The historical fact that must be explained is that people believed they had the experience, not that they actually had it. This is a big problem already. Okay.
So Paulogia claims that there's a big problem with what I say. He said that the historical fact that must be explained is that some people believe they had the experience, not that they actually had it. Now, I wonder what is the problem, because I actually said that, I agree that the historical fact that must be explained is that people believe they had that experience. And I said that I'm going to offer 6 considerations. Actually, there are 8, right? But in my previous talk, I said that there are 6 considerations. I said I'm going to offer 6 considerations to show that they actually had it, right? I did not simply assume that they actually had it. I'm saying I'm going to offer considerations to show that they actually had it. So what is the problem? I don't understand what is the big problem. I mean, I'm not simply assuming that what they actually had it, right? I say I'm going to show it, right? So
you're making an inference
at all. Yeah. Yes. So I think that the problem is not with me. I think the problem is with Paulogia. As we will see later on, he keep misrepresenting me and other scholars and making it seems as if I'm having a problem, when in fact he is actually reading problems into what I said. Right? He's reading mistakes into what I said. So the things that I didn't say or I didn't assume, he seems to say that I assume, to make it seems that there's a big problem with my argument, but actually there is no problem. The problem is that he's reading problems into my argument. That is the problem. He's misrepresenting me in a sense. Okay, so I'm going to point out further other misrepresentations along the way, but this is one of them, just to get started. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about the first consideration. right? So in my previous talk, I mentioned that many ancient people were highly skeptical of bodily resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15:12 says that how come there were some of you, some of the people inside the church who say that there is no resurrection of the dead? And this is from ancient Christian source, and from ancient non-Christian sources, we know that the ancient worldview of Homer, Plato, Cicero, and the rest have no room for resurrection. I mean, that's what N.T. Wright pointed out. Now, next slide. Now, what is Paulogia's response? Now, Paulogia. Oh, okay, can you play the clip?
Yeah, I'll play the clip. Here we go.
The first thing we need to pay attention to is the fact that Paul is writing to people, some of whom were skeptical about the resurrection.
The already converted members of the Christian church in Corinth were skeptical about the resurrection?
Now, I'm going through this very quickly, right? I give far more details in my book.
Well, when I read this section from your book, I see you reference a Corinthian dispute about the nature of how normal humans will be raised in the last days. But in that verse, Paul appeals to their common belief in Jesus' resurrection to anchor his point in resurrection theology. They agree about Jesus.
Okay, now Paulogia says when I read the section of your book, right, he makes it seem as if he has read my book, but actually he has misread it. Now, he need to read it again and also read 1 Corinthians 15 again. Paul was saying, how come some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead, right? So Paul is not just saying that there are disputes about how normal human beings will be raised on the last day. I mean, that is also another point of dispute. As we read 1 Corinthians 15, we understand that there are a few issues that's being disputed. One is some people were claiming that there were no resurrection, and then Paul addressed that, and then later on in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul addresses another question, which is some people were wondering how will people be resurrected, right? But these are two separate issues. Now, Paulogia says that when he read my book, he says that I'm talking about how would there are disputes about how normal people will be resurrected, but actually that was not the issue that I was focusing on in that part of my book, and that was not the issue that Paul was talking about in verse 12. I mean, Paul talked about the issue of how later on, but in verse 12, he is saying that some people say that there's no resurrection, not how, there's no, right? So this is a different issue, right? So Paulogia has misread 1 Corinthians 15, and he has misread my book. Okay, so this is the first point. And the second point is that why would Paul need to ask people to check out the eyewitness in verse 6, right? Paul says, that, now we'll talk about checking out issue later on. But at this point in time, I want to cite some scholars, right? Richard Bauckham, for example, pointed out that in verse 6, Paul is saying, in effect, that a very large number of eyewitnesses are still alive and can be seen and heard. And this is provided to address the problem that the Corinthians, at least some of them, found the resurrection incredible, very hard to believe, right? So this is to address skeptics. And Thiessen and Mertz, the two excellent German scholars, they say that the references to appearances in chronological order is supposed the understanding of 1 Corinthians 15 as an attempt to prove the resurrection of Jesus, right? So why do you need to prove if everyone in 1 Corinthians have no doubts about Jesus' resurrection? If there are no doubts about resurrection, so Paul is addressing that there are some people who are saying that there's no resurrection at all, right? They are denying the resurrection at all, not just about how people will be resurrected, but there are some people who say that there's no resurrection, and that's why Paul needs to address that by saying that they were eyewitness of Jesus' resurrection, and that was supposed to be a proof, right? It's provided as an attempt to prove the resurrection of Jesus, and that is pointed out by Thiessen and Mertz. And as I said earlier on, people who already believe may have doubts again, or they may be new believers, right? They may be new Christians who have doubts, and so and so this will be to be expected, and that's why Paul needs to address that. Now, Paulogia also ignored my discussion of other ancient sources concerning doubts about bodily resurrection in general. So I mentioned Plato and others, right? But Paulogia, he says when I read the section of a book, right, he didn't consider that I discussed those extra biblical, non-Christians corroboration of the point about skepticism about bodily resurrection. He ignored that part of my book. So what I'm trying to say is that Paulogia makes it seems as if he has read my book, and he presented it in his video, right, for his audience, so that people who watch his video thinks that I have made a mistake. But actually that is misleading, right? Because the fact is that Paulogia hasn't read my book carefully. He has misread it, but he gives the false impression, that there's a problem with my argument, and then he conveyed that impression to people who watch his video and mislead people, right? So
most of those people are not going to read your book.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm surprised at how many people. I look at some of the comments in YouTube. I'm surprised at how many people, actually says, "Oh, Paulogia, you did a good job. Paulogia, you have debunked Andrew Loke." But I'm surprised at how many people actually don't read my book. They just believe what Paulogia says, and they are misled by Paulogia, right? So I think Paulogia owe me an apology, for misrepresenting me. So I'm honestly quite upset about this, right? That he misread it, and then there are some people who comment, and yet there are some people who think that Paulogia is a good researcher. He's very scholarly. Some people think that he even should already have a PhD. But as I look at Paulogia's video again and again, what I find again and again, what I found is that when I listen to him, he says some things about what some scholars say. But when I read those scholars again, I find that is not exactly what those scholars are saying. So again and again, he misrepresents scholars again and again. And I'm going to illustrate with more examples as we go along, right? But what I'm trying to show here is that a lot of people have mistaken impression about Paulogia. They think that he's a careful researcher, when the fact is that he isn't a careful researcher. He has misrepresented myself and other scholars again and again. All right. Can we move on? All right, can you play this clip? Next one.
Yep, clip number 4. Here we go.
That since Paul is repeating what others told him, Paul is not inviting readers to check for themselves. He's repeating someone else's invitation.
After he goes through this oral formula, this creed or whatever you may want to call it, in chapter 15, verses 3 through 7, and then verse 8, Paul adds his own testimony about Jesus appearing to him.
This bold, "if you don't believe me, ask around" stance doesn't come from the part Paul added. It comes from whoever gave this to Paul.
Okay, so here, Paulogia says that Paul was merely repeating others' invitation, and he cited Lycona in support of his view. Now, actually, it was Paul's own invitation, and Paulogia has actually misrepresented Lycona, actually. Now, in that video clip, Lycona was actually talking in very general terms, in conversation with Dale Ellison, and he was making general remarks about Paul writing about what other people, Paul writing about the claims about other people, and then his own claim, but Lycona wasn't giving a very detailed analysis there. I mean, he's just making some very general remarks. But when you look at Lycona's own detailed analysis in his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Analysis, published in 2010, if you look at pages 319 and page 320, Lycona said that Jesus appeared to more than 500 brothers at the same time, from whom most remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. He put this in parentheses, and then he goes on to say that Paul's parenthetical phrase that most of the more than 500 to whom Jesus appeared at a single event is quite interesting, because according to Paul, most of them were still alive and could be questioned. So it was something that it was a parenthesis, that Paul added there about the point that most remain until now. So it was Paul's invitation. It was not in the original, right? In fact, if you look at Gordon Fee's commentary, Gordon Fee wrote that the words "most of whom are still living, although some have fallen asleep," this is a Pauline edition. This is a Pauline invitation, Pauline edition, right? Because it disrupts the line-by-line mentioning of eyewitness, right? So if you look at 1 Corinthians 15, if you look at if you analyze the text, right, Paul was passing on a tradition. Is line by line, appear to Cephas and to the 12, to the more than 500, and then to James and then to other apostles, right? It's line by line, and then the most of whom appear until now is something that disrupt, right, the line by line mention, right? So in a traditional formula, in a creed, right, it'll be line by line, it'll be straightly line by line, but there's a disruption there which indicates, right, that it is something that is added in, and obviously Paul is adding in something there because the phrase about most of whom were alive, I mean, that is time index, right? That's time index. I mean, people who were alive 20 years ago may not be alive now, right? But Paul is emphasizing now, right? So it is time index thing that Paul is putting in there, and it disrupts the line by line mentioning, and that's why most scholars agree when they study the phrase, how the line is arranged. It's very obvious that this is something that is added in, and that's why all commentators, according to Gordon Fee, who wrote an excellent commentary on 1 Corinthians 15, all the commentators, including Lycona himself, agree that this is a parenthetical remark that came from Paul himself. So it was Paul's invitation. It was not something that Paul is just passing on, right? So again, Paulogia got it wrong. He has misrepresented Lycona by just listening to one clip without actually studying carefully what Lycona actually wrote. And so this is another problem which I find with Paulogia. I think he just focused, and also a lot of people nowadays. And a lot of people nowadays, they just listen, but they don't read. They don't actually check out the facts, right? So a lot of people just listen to Paulogia and without actually reading my book, for example, right? And so now, of course, it's important to listen, but we have to learn to read as well, right? We have to learn to check the facts. We have to learn to read and to analyze, and that is a very important skill, which I find is lacking in Paulogia. Because when he read, he misread, he misread, and sometimes he just listen without actually checking out, right? What people actually write. Now, it's more important to check out the writing rather than because especially for scholarly books, right? Because scholars, they would present their careful arguments in writing. Sometimes when people give a talk, right, people may just be making some general remarks, and people may be saying things in very quickly. Right, and so, but to really look at the arguments, we have to read the writings. You cannot just listen to people, right? You cannot just listen to scholars, and certainly you cannot just listen to Paulogia, because Paulogia misrepresents scholars again and again, right? So you cannot just listen to Paulogia. Definitely not Paulogia, right? But if you want to listen to scholars, but the best thing is that you read the writings, and that is very important. So if you check out the writings of Lycona, you'll find that he and other commentators, they all agree that this is what Paul's invitation. In any case, Paul wouldn't be passing on something that he doesn't affirm himself, right? So it's very clear here that Paul himself is inviting people to check out the eyewitness, right? This is an important point. And the reason why he does that is because, as I said earlier on, there were some people in the church who were skeptical about bodily resurrection. Okay, so I have already established this point. Okay, let's move on to the next slide.
Well, I'm curious to hear what you've got to say about the last line here. And in any case, Paul wouldn't pass on something that he doesn't affirm himself. I'd like to hear you talk about that.
Oh, I already mentioned earlier on. I'm saying that even if this is something that Paul just passes on, right? He wouldn't pass on something that he himself doesn't agree, right? So and if he doesn't agree, he would say. Most likely he would say why he doesn't agree. I mean, Paul is not somebody who would just agree with the apostles, right? I mean, we know that he has some disagreements with Peter, and when he disagrees, he will say why, right? So what I'm saying here is that Paul is passing on something that he affirmed himself, right? That there were these people, and that is just in any case remarks. I mean, Paul says that this is what the fact that we are preaching that there were these people. It's not just me, but other apostles also preached that there were these people. So. Yeah, and Paul was saying this in response to skeptics.
Yeah, what I take this to be, this point here is you basically saying, look, even if Paulogia is right, and he was accurately representing Lycona, or basically any other scholar, if that was the correct way to view these things, then it still doesn't go against your point that he's talking to a skeptical audience.
Yeah, that's right.
So it at best it doesn't really interact with your argument.
Yeah, that's right.
Even though he's misrepresented the scholarship.
Uh-huh.
Putting the
Yep.
misrepresentation aside. All right, let's move on. Here we go.
Yeah. Mhm.
All right, should I cue up the next clip here?
Yeah, please show it.
All right.
Then you have examples of more and less rigorous epistemological standards, and a spectrum of resurrection philosophies from ancient times and places that aren't Corinth in 55 AD, as addressed in the letter. Pointing out that not everyone believed Christian claims doesn't demonstrate that those who did accept it had rigorous reasons to believe. Some skeptics of UFOs come to believe in alien abduction. That doesn't imply that they had epistemologically sound reasons for doing so. And I might just as well appeal to the non-believers of the time and insist that they were the ones who were intellectually rigorous about checking the available evidence for resurrection claims, finding it wildly insufficient, so their conclusions were correct.
Okay, so here, Paulogia is raising some objections concerning the epistemological standard of the early Christians. Now, my response is that I point out on page 50 of my book that Paul indicated what the epistemological standard was. In verse 6, Paul implies to check out the eyewitness themselves, right? So that is that is a high epistemological standard, right? To check out the eyewitness themselves. As Craig Keener pointed out in his commentary, similar appeals to public knowledge can be found in the writings of Josephus and Cicero, right? So what Paul is writing in a style that conveys the idea that it is public knowledge that people can check out for themselves, right? So that is the standard. And this commonsensical idea of checking out these eyewitnesses is implicit in 1 Corinthians, according to Richard Bauckham, a letter which was intended for public reading in the churches, right? So it's not just some private letter, right? It's a public letter to be read in the church. Paul is in fact saying that if anyone wants to check the tradition, a very large number of people are still alive and can be seen and heard, right? So that is the standard. Now, as for skeptics of UFOs, well, we need to consider case by case. So some cases could be due to illusion, some cases could be due to hallucination. I mean, there are different explanations for different claims about UFO, and we need to examine it case by case. And in any case, that doesn't excuse us from the need to consider this case concerning the resurrection, right, where the standard is pretty rigorous, right, is to check out the eyewitness themselves. Okay, next slide. Now, Paulogia also said that there were people who didn't believe, and he claimed that those people who didn't believe is because the unbelievers had a more rigorous standard. Now, there's no proof of that. Right? This is total speculation from Paulogia. There's no proof that those unbelievers actually use a more rigorous standard. In fact, like many skeptics, people at the time would have mocked and simply dismissed. They would think that, well, it's just superstition without further consideration of the evidence, right? So, that is a reasonable assumption based on what we see from Tacitus, right? He just dismissed it as a superstition without consideration of any evidence concerning Christianity. And and moreover, the Christian doctrine of the crucified God being crucified, would have been regarded by many in antiquity as a shameless impertinence and absurdity, right? So, Hanger pointed out this out. Right? Many people just simply dismiss it. And moreover, given the Jews' widespread expectation of a Messiah who would deliver them from foreign powers, for the Roman Empire, for example, the claim that a person who was shamefully crucified by the Romans was a Messiah and was truly divine would have been extremely difficult for the Jews to believe, right? And that is no wonder why many Jews did not convert, because many of the ancient Jews were expecting a Messiah who will deliver them from the Romans. But Jesus did not do that. In fact, on the contrary, Jesus was crucified by the enemies. So this will have made it very difficult for the Jews to believe in Jesus. So what I'm saying is that the fact that they didn't believe doesn't mean that they have a higher epistemological standard. Rather, there are far more plausible reasons for why they didn't believe, right? As I explained here in this slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, now the second consideration is that the resurrection of Jesus was foundational to the Christian faith. Now, Paulogia accepts this point, so I don't have to say very much about this, right? Because it's very clear that for the earliest Christians, if Christ has not been raised, then faith is futile, right? So this shows that the resurrection is foundational. And so what this implies is that if people check out and people found that actually there were no such people, right? There were no 500 or 12. If the fact-checking falsified Paul's claim, then the early Christians would have left the faith, given that you have been shown to be in vain. Because remember, for the early Christians, the resurrection is foundational to their faith, and the resurrection itself. So why? And what is foundational to the resurrection? Why do they believe the resurrection? Is because there were people who claimed to have seen Jesus alive. And that was why Paul cited the tradition right at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 15. Right, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the 12, and then 500, and then the groups of people, Peter, etc. So what I'm saying is that for the early Christians, their faith is based on the resurrection, and the resurrection is based on the eyewitness. Right, the eyewitness claims is foundational to everything else, to the belief in the resurrection. Right. So if the eyewitness part is falsified, right, they will have reject the resurrection and left the faith. Now, we have good reasons to think that that is not true, that they didn't actually falsify it, because, as I said earlier on, 1 Corinthians was in fact highly regarded, right, by the early Christians as a very important document. Right? It was not something that they threw into the rubbish bin. It's not something that Paul is talking rubbish. They should throw away. If Paul was talking rubbish here on such a crucial point, 1 Corinthians 15 would not have been regarded by the early Christians to be an important document, right? So Paul wouldn't have the Corinthians will have just left the faith, right? So and therefore, given that this is the case, right, it's very important to note that on this point, right, if fact-checking falsified Paul's claims, that the early Christians would have left the faith, and they would not have kept 1 Corinthians 15 as such an important document, which was later on regarded as divinely inspired. Right? No way. I mean, they would have thrown this in the rubbish bin, right, as a kind of false claim letter. Okay, next slide, please. Now, the third point is something contentious, right? So this Paulogia has quite a lot to say about this. Now, the third point I mentioned was that the resurrection of Jesus was something that the earliest Christians were willing to die for, right? And I cited the passages from 1 Corinthians 15, which reveal what they believe, right? And Paul talks about the early Christians being in danger for their faith. Okay. Now, next slide, please. So what does Paulogia have to say in response? Can you play this clip? This is a very important clip. Please play it.
Yep.
Let's grant that and move on to...
The early Christians were prepared to give up their life. Right? They were for their faith. Right? So this is a life and death issue.
Oh no, Andrew. We were almost moving on. And then you casually slip in an allusion to martyrdom defense. I'm trying to let your favorite Christian sources do most of the talking, so I'll throw to Dr. Sean McDowell.
I think there's also been a hyper trust by many Christians who read martyrs and says, hey, they all died as martyrs, and they proclaim it. Well, I've made that claim in the past, so I repent on this show from making that before I did my research. That should be corrected as well.
Andrew is attempting to establish exactly who and how many actual witnesses to resurrected Jesus there are, and in particular that it's more than 2 to 4 people.
People will not be willing to sacrifice for what they knew is false, right? A lot of people will be willing to die for what they think is true, even though that may not be true. But you won't find groups of people, right, who will be willing to die, right, for what they know is false.
Here, Dr. Loke is affirming that he's saying that eyewitnesses specifically are the guarantors, not any second-hand believers.
Okay. So now it's important to note here that Sean McDowell was arguing against the view that there is good evidence to show that all the apostles died as martyrs, and I wasn't arguing otherwise, right? So now Paul, so there's actually no contradiction between me and Sean on this point. Now Paulogia actually took me out of context. I said that the earliest Christians were prepared, they were willing to sacrifice their lives, and people will not be willing to sacrifice what they know is false. In the original context, I was highlighting the importance of Jesus' resurrection for the early Christians, including those in Corinth. I'm not using this point to argue directly for how many people suffered, right? And so he took me out of context. Now, in any case, my point is consistent with what Sean wrote in his book, The Faith of the Apostles, page 259. Sean says, the critical point is not that we might establish the martyrdom of all the apostles, rather their willingness to suffer and die for their first-hand witness. That is of foremost importance. Well, people were willing to die for what they believe is true. It's a stretch to think that all the apostles were willing to sacrifice, suffer and die for a claim that they knew was false, right? So what Sean says is what I said was what Sean says, right? And we both agree that the critical point is not how many actually died, but their willingness to die, which is what I emphasize as well. Okay, next slide, please. Now, okay, play this clip, please.
Yeah.
And yet, if we want to go down the evidence for persecuted preaching of actual eyewitnesses, how many does the Christian expert cited by Andrew think we have?
Of the 12, there's only 2 that we have very high confidence died, historically speaking. And that's Peter and James, the brother of John, James, son of Zebedee. The others, I'm not even sure we can know at all what history is or where legend begins.
This willing to die argument doesn't boost your eyewitness numbers. The evidence doesn't support it.
Okay. Now, here, if you look at this clip, it seems that if you just listen to Paulogia, right, it seems that only 2 we have confidence died as martyrs, according to Sean McDowell, right? Peter and James. And then the others, we can't be sure at all. So this makes it, so if you just listen to Paulogia's cutting and pasting, right, from Sean McDowell, it makes it seem as if Sean McDowell argues that there's only evidence for only 2 who were actually martyred. Now, however, if you compare with Sean's original recording, you'll find that that is not the case. Can you play the clip from Sean's original?
Bottom line, I would argue that of the 12, there's only 2 that we have very high confidence died, historically speaking. And that's Peter and James, the brother of John, James, son of Zebedee. And I would say outside of the 12, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, we also have very high confidence. And then there's 2 I would put in that middle range that are arguably more probable than not, but the sources are less and they're a little late. That would be Thomas and Andrew. And the rest of the 12, what's left of them, I think that's 8. I don't think we know when history ends and legend begins. The sources are late and they're contradictory. We just don't know that. That's the honest truth of, I think, where the history points.
Okay, so if you look at the original recording, Sean did not just mention 2. He actually mentioned James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul. We also have very high confidence. And then he argues that Thomas and Andrew, well, there is evidence for them as well. It's more probable than not. If you read his book, right, he says more probable than not, which means that there is evidence, right, for them. So it is actually 6. It is not just 2. So, Paulogia, his video is so misleading, right? He actually underestimated by 300%, right? From 6, he makes it seems as if there's only 2. Right? He underestimated, but he makes people think that there's 300% less, right? According to Sean McDowell. I mean, that is so terrible. Now, you know how I realized this? Actually, I was having some conversation with some other people online, and I keep hearing people citing from Paulogia, and then I keep hearing that people say that, oh, we only have 2, we only have 2, we only have 2. And so I become puzzled because I read Sean McDowell's book quite a while ago prior to writing my book, right? I read his book. And so I keep hearing people saying that there is only 2. So I decided to read Sean McDowell's book again to refresh my memory, right? To check out again, and sure enough, when I read Sean McDowell's book, I find that, hey, how come what I'm reading is so different from what I hear from Paulogia? So and then I go back to check the recording again. I find that Paulogia has played a very deceptive trick. He has cut and paste, right? He cut the front part and the back part and take away the middle part, make it seem as if there's only two. And sure enough, there are people who are talking online saying that there's only two, right? Evidence for only two. So people have been misled by Paulogia. This is a fact, that people have been misled by Paulogia, and that is so bad. I mean, that's such a deception, right? Misleading. That shows the kind of terrible research that Paulogia is doing, and the kind of bad effect that it is causing people to have the kind of misconceptions, right, about concerning the resurrection. So again and again, I found that when I check out the original source, it's quite different from what Paulogia says. He has misrepresented Sean McDowell here, and the cutting and pasting is really quite deceptive. Now, I have some more points to add. Right, it is important to note that Sean is not saying that only 6 was martyred. He was saying that there is evidence, right, to show that 6, but he's not saying that only 6, right? I mean, the absence of evidence is not always equal to the absence, right? So it could be that there may be others, but we lack the evidence to show it. So this is the first point that we need to note. And second point is that Sean is also definitely not saying that only 2 were willing to be martyred. On the contrary, Sean argues that, in fact, we have reliable historical evidence to trust the ancient and uniform testimony that all the apostles were willing to die for their faith, right? So the willingness is the critical point here, okay? Because as Sean and myself have argued, right, people will not be willing to die for what they know is false. Now, whether they actually die or not, right, that is not the key point, right? The key point is their willingness, which shows that they are not. It's not. They are not dying. People will not be willing to die for a fraud. So this shows that it's not the resurrection is not a make-up story, right, by the early Christians and by the earliest Christians. And this is an important point. This is the critical point. Okay, next slide, please. And as I said earlier on, the written first-hand sources may just be the tip of the iceberg. We need to look at other considerations, right? And I mentioned in my book as well, right? There are various considerations which indicate that the earliest Christians are willing to die for their faith. And one consideration is that the earliest Christians, they are following Jesus, right? Who was crucified, who was killed, right? So it was not like people following Elvis Presley, I mean, I have read again and again, some people commented on YouTube, right? That, I mean, there are also some people who claim Elvis Presley resurrected or somebody. I mean, in the case of Elvis Presley, it could be that some people were pretending to be him. I mean, yeah, there are people who dress up like Elvis Presley, after Elvis Presley died, and then people saw him, they think, oh, that guy is Elvis resurrected, but actually, it was somebody who dressed up like him, right? Now, in the case of Elvis, people can dress up like him. Well, it won't be. I mean, there's no harmful consequences. I mean, that guy, we don't know who dressed up like Elvis would not be. He wouldn't be worried that if he'll be caught. I mean, this is just a joke, right? This is just for fun. But if somebody dressed up like Jesus, well, that guy will risk being crucified himself, right? Because Jesus himself was crucified, right? So people wouldn't be so stupid, right, to pretend to be Jesus, right, who was a crucified criminal during that time, and so we need to understand this, right? That the earliest Christians were following a crucified leader, right, and which means that they have to be prepared, right, to for a similar fate to fall on them as well, right? So this is the first consideration. And the second consideration is that Paul admitted to public knowledge of persecuting Christians and being persecuted himself and in constant danger, right? He's appealing to public knowledge. And the willingness of the earliest Christians to sacrifice instead of renouncing their faith can also be shown by the fact that they continued their mission, right, for years after years, even though they have seen fellow Christians persecuted for it, right? Even though they have seen some of them died for it, but the others still continue to proclaim, knowing that a similar fate fell on them, right? So this continuation of their mission shows their willingness to sacrifice. Now, there are a lot more to say about this. I don't have time to go through in detail, but I'll encourage readers to check out McDowell's book, The Fate of the Apostles, which present a very thorough case to present the evidence to show that the apostles, all of them, according to Sean McDowell, all the apostles were willing, I'm saying, right, the willingness to die for their faith. Don't rely on Paulogia's misrepresentation of McDowell. Okay. All right. Okay. Next slide, please. Now, sometimes Paulogia and others have said, well, maybe the disciples were persecuted for other reasons, or maybe because some of them were posing a threat to the temple or refusing to sacrifice to Roman gods. Now, however, Larry Furtado the historian of early Christianity, has responded by saying that the doctrine of Jesus' resurrection was fundamental to the earliest Christians' confession of Jesus as Lord, and therefore to their behavior as Christians, which resulted in persecution. So the resurrection is still foundational. So even though they may not be persecuted directly for their faith in the resurrection, but nevertheless, they are still persecuted for the resurrection. They are still persecuted for the resurrection in the sense that the resurrection is foundational to their behavior, which resulted in persecution. Okay, so this is an important point. So as I already mentioned earlier on, the earliest Christians were willing to die for their faith, and for their, which resulted in their behavior, which resulted in their persecution, and their belief in Jesus' resurrection was foundational to their faith and to their behavior, and the experiences of the eyewitnesses was foundational to their belief that Jesus resurrected. Okay, so this is very important to bear in mind. Okay, next slide, please. Now, the willingness to sacrifice arguments is merely used as one of the considerations in my arguments. By itself, it does not imply that the resurrection is true, right? So I've seen a lot of YouTubers, they comment that, oh, just because people are willing to die, that means that's true. No, that's not what I said, right? Now, of course, we know that there are Islamic terrorists, for example, right, who also sacrifice for their faith, right? So I'm not saying that because the Islamic terrorists are sacrificed for their faith, therefore what they believe is true. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that just because there are some Mormons who are willing to sacrifice for their faith, therefore Mormonism is true. No, that is not what I said. Right? I never say that just because people are willing to sacrifice, therefore what they believe is true. Right? I never said that. I agree that many people are willing to sacrifice what they think is true, but it might not be true. Because their willingness to sacrifice does not imply that they have been in a position to find out whether what they believe is true, or that other naturalistic hypotheses have been ruled out. So, for example, with regards to the Islamic terrorists, Sean McDowell pointed out that they were not eyewitnesses of any events in the life of Muhammad, for example. Whereas the early Christians, including those in Corinth, were in a position to find out whether there were these people or not. I'll talk about this later on. They could find out, right? I'll talk about this point later on, and that these people were in a position to falsify what they saw, and there are good reasons to rule out other naturalistic hypotheses, like the Sun hypothesis, for example, right? Which hardly any scholar hold this view anymore because of the various considerations against this view, which I explained, which me and other scholars have already mentioned. So the case of the resurrection is unique, right, in this sense, because unlike other cases of people being willing to die for their faith, in those other cases, we don't have good reasons to rule out other naturalistic alternatives. But in the case of the resurrection, we not only have the disciples willing to die for their faith, that by itself doesn't prove that the resurrection is true. We still need to rule out other naturalistic alternatives, such as hallucination, for example, or Sun hypothesis, for example. And we do have good reason and evidence to rule out those other naturalistic alternatives, and to conclude that Jesus resurrected. So that is what is unique about the case of Jesus' resurrection, right, compared to other cases in which followers were willing to die for their faith. Okay, so that's an important point to emphasize. Next slide, please. Okay, now the fourth point is that I mentioned that people could check out whether there were eyewitnesses or not. Because I mentioned in my previous talk that we have intra and so we have Christian and non-Christian sources indicating that the or rather I should say that there's sources in the canonical writings and also by early church fathers which indicate that the early Christian movement was a network of close communication. Christians were in communication with one another, and the early Christian leaders were quite mobile. They were moving around, and many Jewish Christians who have traveled to Jerusalem for festivals where they can meet one another and talk with one another, communicate with one another, right? So people can check out, right, whether there were these people or not, right? Whether they were the 12 who claim to have seen Jesus, whether that is true or not, right? People can check out. People could check out. Next slide. Okay, now, okay, I think there's a clip from Allison, which can you play it, please?
There is. Here we go.
The third consideration is that people can check out if there were indeed these eyewitnesses or not.
Okay, we're finally getting somewhere.
Right. So Paul claimed that there were 12 and then 500 and then another group. Now the readers of his letters can easily verify if this is so.
So you take the appearance to the 500. You just ask any question and you don't know the answer. Who were these people? Were they in the south? Were they in the north? Were they in Galilee? Were they in Jerusalem? But what they saw, how many of these people knew Jesus really well? How did they see him? Really, how did they see him? 500 people, that's a lot. Now it's got to be an approximation, but was there a receiving line? Is there a jumbotron? My point is that I don't know the answers to any of these questions. I can't name a single person who was there. Can't name a single person who was there. You can ask questions of these texts, and they turn out in many ways to be what I would call thin. They don't have thick descriptions, and they don't carry a lot of data with them. The 500 just isn't there.
Okay, so again, if you just look at this clip, you would think that, well, Allison disagree. It seems that Allison disagree, right, about the 500. Actually, but if you look at the original interview with Allison, you'll find that Allison himself actually agrees that there were indeed this group of people who had the experience. So it's not like Paulogia who think that there were only 2 people, but Allison agreed that there were indeed the 500 who had some sort of experience, even though we, according to Allison, we don't know what kind of experience they had, but Allison does think that there were this group of people. And he thought that this group of people were a post-Pentecostal crowd. So can you play the original clip from Allison, please?
I come back to this again and again and again. So you take the appearance to the 500. You just ask any question and you don't know the answer. Who were these people? Were they in the south? Were they in the north? Were they in Galilee? Were they in Jerusalem? I think myself that about the only thing we can know is that, or say is probable, is that it's post-Pentecostal. I can't imagine a crowd of 500 being gathered before the public proclamation of the resurrection at Pentecost. So I think this is a post-Pentecostal crowd. But what they saw, how many of these people knew Jesus really well? How did they see him? Really, how did they see him? 500 people, that's a lot. Now it's got to be an approximation, but was there a receiving line? Is there a jumbotron? Some of the church fathers actually think this must have been something like Acts, a heavenly vision. So he's somewhere up in the clouds, and they can see him at once. Anyway, my point is that I don't know the answers to any of these questions. I can't name a single person who was there. Can't name a single person who was there.
Okay, so again, if you listen to Paulogia's version, he's cutting and pasting. And if you look at the original, again, you'll see that it is quite different. It is very importantly different, right? If you just listen to Paulogia's extraction, it seems that Ellison doesn't think that they were the 500. But if you listen carefully to Ellison, you'll find that there is a very important part which Paulogia cut away, right? He cut away the part where Ellison thinks that we can know, or it's probably true, that this was the post-Pentecostal crowd. This was a post-Pentecost event, right? So Paulogia, so Ellison does think that there were this group of people, right? So and this is an important point because this point contradicts Paulogia's own hypothesis, right? Because Paulogia thinks that there was only 2 people, right, who had experience, but Ellison thinks that there were more than 2. In fact, the 500 had also some kind of experience. So Ellison actually disagreed with Paulogia, not me, right? So this is an important point. Now we need to distinguish between how many people had the experience and the quality of the experience, which was Ellison's point. Ellison says, were they, what did they actually know Jesus well? What did they actually see? Was it a jumbotron or whatever? That concerns the quality of the experience. But so we need to distinguish between the quality of the experience and how many people had the experience, right? These are 2 distinct points, right? Now remember, my issue with Paulogia, so I hope that point is clear, right? Now, I do address the quality issue in chapter 7 of my book, where I respond, right, to some of the concerns that Ellison, similar to those that Ellison raised, not exactly the same concerns, but his concern about the quality issue, right? I mean, the quality issue in general, I discussed in chapter 7, which people can read up. But at this point in time, I just want to focus on the how many people issue, right? Because that is the key issue of contention between me and Paulogia. And on this point, Ellison actually agrees with me against Paulogia. And so I find it astonishing that he actually cites Ellison against me by his cutting and pasting, which is deceptive, right? He cut away the key part to make it seem as if Ellison disagrees with me. But when you check out the original clip, right, you'll find that actually Ellison disagrees with Paulogia, right? So that is an important point.
Yeah,
so,
it's very he did cut that out. He cut it out purposefully because he knew that it contradicted what his point was, and this is so deceptive. Yeah, that's really bad. That's really, really bad. I mean, he's done that in a couple other occasions as well, but this one was just flagrant. As he calls you flagrantly disregarding something later on, but I think this was flagrant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's called me something flagrant. That is also his flagrant misrepresentation of me as well, right? I will talk about that later on. But he has misrepresented Lycona, he has misrepresented McDowell, he has misrepresented Ellison. I mean that is quite deceptive the way he does that with his cutting and pasting, right? That's just terrible.
All right, let's move on.
Okay, let's move on. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Andrew, it looked like you cut out for just a second. Go ahead and start again.
Okay. Am I still there? Can you hear me?
I think you're still here. I can hear you.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, the connection might be going in and out.
All right.
Hopefully. Okay. All right. It looks like he's gone. Yeah, sorry about that, guys. Hopefully he'll be back again. This has happened. If you're just joining us or if you joined late, this has happened twice already. So just normal connection issues. I assume that he'll be back and will join us momentarily. But if you don't know this, Dr. Loke is joining us all the way from Hong Kong, and I think it's 12 a.m. over there right now. So here he is. He's calling. Let's pull him back in. All right. Here he is. He's back.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that. Okay. Yeah.
No worries.
Okay. So there are some more points which I want to add. One point, very important point, is that what we don't know about does not imply that the Corinthians didn't know about. Remember, we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg, right? So when we listen to Ellison, Ellison says that there are a lot of things that we don't know about, right? About the 500 people. For example, were they in the south? Were they in the north? Right? He says, no, we don't know these things. Now, the fact that we don't know doesn't mean that the Corinthians didn't know, right? This is a very important point to note. In fact, Edison himself observed that the Christians in Corinth or anywhere else, they would not have believed based on the scanty information in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8 alone, without wanting to know about the details. For example, what did the disciples see? Did they actually touch Jesus? No details like this. So Edison conclude that this passage in 1 Corinthians 15 must have been a summary of traditional resurrection narratives which were told in fuller forms elsewhere. Okay, so this is what Edison emphasized in his book. Now, this is a very important point, right? Because a lot of skeptics make mistake on this point. A lot of skeptics, including Paulogia, it seems, they seem to think that, well, if 1 Corinthians didn't say it, that means that nobody knows about it. Actually, that's not true. I mean,
so I assume that he'll be back in just a second. So in the meantime, I wish I had something planned, like something fun or funny to say, but I don't have anything fun or funny to say. I can give you a quick update on our conference while we're waiting for Andrew to come back. So we are still in the process of finalizing some details about our upcoming CC 21 conference that is happening August 26th through the 28th of 2021. Right now we're talking with our venue right now, which is a church in Houston, and we're super, super excited about it. We announced actually the speaker list and everything in another video, so highly recommend that you go check that out. It's with myself and Brittany. Brittany is my wife, if you didn't know that, and she recently joined us full-time to help plan all of these conferences and also be our point of contact with all of our supporters and to do really special things with them. All right, Andrew's joining us again. Here he is. Okay, we are back.
Yeah. Sorry, again. I think it should be fine now. I said that. Okay, so
okay.
Yeah, okay. So Edison emphasized that we need to have in harmony with this common sense, right? Which rightly assumes simple human curiosity, that people would be interested to find out more, right? So this is based on elementary psychological considerations. It is as elementary as the disciples need to pee and poo, right? I mean, people will not just listen to, Paul says, there's this 500 and without wanting to know what exactly, right, are these people seeing, right? Where what did they actually see? Did they actually touch Jesus? People will be interested to find out, and so this is a basic common sense. Now I need to say something about common sense because I see somebody criticize me on this point too, right? On YouTube. Now some people say that common sense is not reliable, and some common sense may be false, but here, what I mean by common sense is what Edison mean by common sense, which is referring to elementary psychological considerations, which is as elementary biological considerations, right? It's as commonsensical as the disciples will need to pee and poo, right? So this kind of inference is as reliable as anything else, right? This is a basic fact that about human nature, which the disciples wouldn't have just believed based on the scanty information that is written alone. I mean, that was Edison's point, that there must have been other details that are available to them, but not to us. But to them, it was available, that provided them with the extra with the additional information. And so Gerhardson, another scholar who is one of the pioneers of the memory studies applied to New Testament, he says that elementary psychological considerations tell us that the early Christians could scarcely have mentioned such intriguing events without being able to elaborate on them. So what this means is that Paul must have elaborated on this when in other formats, right? Not in writing, but remember, Paul was not writing to strangers. Paul himself visited the Corinthians a few times. We know about this from his letters. And when he visited them, Paul would not just tell them what is written in the letter, right? Paul would have said a lot of other things, right? It's just like, when I visit you, Cameron, if I visit you, I will not just tell you about what I write or what we talk about in the interview, right? I will have add a lot of other things, which is not found in my writings. I will have communicated to you in many other ways. And certainly, Paul would have done that. And it's important to note that Paul was appealing to common knowledge, right? This is the point that Craig Keener was emphasizing. And so Paul is saying that, the 500, this is common knowledge. You all know that there were these people. I mean, you can easily find out that there were these people, right? So people can check out for themselves. It's public knowledge that people could check out. So this is an important point. Okay, next slide, please. Now, sometimes I hear some people say, well, Corinth to Jerusalem is a long distance. People, will not be easy to travel. But as I said earlier on, the so-called eyewitnesses, if they exist, they will not have all stay put in Jerusalem, right? They will have moved around preaching, right? And in any case, as I said earlier on, the Jewish Christians will have traveled early to Jerusalem for festival. So, Christians, there'll be some, who meet together secretly, as they go for festival, they meet together secretly, and they will just talk with each other. They can chat with each other. And Hurtado pointed out that, there's this well-attested networking among the early Christianity. So this involved various activities. For example, they send exchange letters and traveling to promote their views, right? So in Paul's letter, it mentioned about men from James, Apollos travel around, representatives sent for a conference with other believers elsewhere, right? So there were meetings together. There were kind of meetings, people meeting together secretly. And they were sent to other believers to express solidarity. So there are plenty of connections and exchanging. So people could easily find out whether there were indeed 12 people who claimed they saw, or indeed 500 people who claimed they saw, right? So people could easily verify all these things. Okay, next slide. Okay, so Hurtado pointed out that travel and communication were comparatively well developed in the Roman world generally among the wealthy and good many ordinary people for business, pilgrimage, occasions for health, consult oracles, for athletic events, sightseeing, other purposes. So, as Richard Bauckham observed, the context in which the early Christian movement developed was not conducive to parochialism, quite the opposite. Indeed, in the world of frequent travel and communication, the early Christian particularly seem to have been given to networking, devoting impressive resources of time, money, and personnel to this, and on the wide translocal scale. Okay. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so, and we need to note that this 1 Corinthians was written relatively early, right? It was written within 25 years after the crucifixion, where most of these people were still, if they exist, they were still supposed to be alive, right? And in fact, that was what Paul claims. Paul claims that most of them remain until now. So Paul is inviting any reader to check the truth, right? And he couldn't have got away. Yeah.
I've heard some scholars even date the creed all the way down to what, 3 months, within 3 months of the crucifixion.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's good reason for that as well. Yeah. But in any case, it is early, right? And people could check. And Paul couldn't have got away with this, right? If this is not true. Okay. So that's the important point. Now, next point, please. Next slide, please. Okay.
All right,
can you play the next clip?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and play the clip for this one.
I've also told stories, and within a week heard someone else tell that story, and it's already morphing into something else. I remember being at Duke as a graduate student and hearing a legend about Dale Allison told me by somebody who knew me, being spread by people who were there when I was there. It was not true, but people were spreading this story. And the fact that I said that didn't happen, I'm sure it didn't stop the spread of the story, right? So recently, for example, I was asked to write a paper on Simeon Stylites. He's the weird fellow several centuries after the first century. There are 3 early biographies of this character, one written while he's still alive, but the one I'm interested in most was written within 14 years of his death. It was written by people who lived in his monastery or in the immediate area. It is full of information from eyewitnesses and people who knew Simeon. But the thing is, this comes from Simeon's time and place, and it's full of stuff nobody believes, but the author clearly believed. So when you run into things like that, and when you spend a lot of time with those texts, as I have, you're just less sanguine about eyewitnesses.
Okay, So here, Ellison is saying that sometimes stories can get changed. Yeah, but in Ellison's case, people did check with him, right? And the person who spread the story didn't get away. I mean, Ellison got him. And the second point to note is that in Ellison's case, and also in the case of Simeon Stylites, which he mentioned, there is no persecution. And so, people get caught, right? But so what, right? I mean, there's no serious consequence. I mean, this is unlike the case of early Christians, right? As I said, there's a context of that Jesus himself was crucified, right? So people who follow him will have to be prepared to suffer a similar fate, right? And also, the stories of Ellison and Simon Stylites are not foundational to their beliefs. Now, we need to consider the possibility of fraud in Simeon's case as well. So during Simeon's time, there was already a monastery set up, and we know that in the Middle Ages, there are plenty of trade about religious relics, right? So people were trading about the bones of dead saints, the hairs of dead saints. So given this context, people and there was no persecution, right, for that. So people can be telling stories, make up stories about, these saints did wonderful things, and then use this, to attract people to come and visit the relics and to make money from it, right? To give donations to the churches and to make money. So it is important, to note this. And in fact, this kind of stories is not unique to medieval Christianity. I mean, it's found in many other religions as well. So, for example, in Buddhism, right? I mean, there's also a lot of stories about relics, right, being made use of, right, to get money. And on this point, I just think that Ellison, right? I think that people who I have found it very strange that again and again that people who seems to be very critical, very skeptical when it comes to the resurrection, but when they talk about other religions or other cases, they seem to be less critical. They seem to put off their critical hats. I mean, didn't Ellison consider the possibility of fraud in this case? And in Ellison's interview with Mike Licona, in fact, Ellison talks about the rainbow body in the Buddhist tradition, where some people claim that the body will dematerialize and become like rainbow, right? And Ellison says, "Oh, I don't know what to make of this." Well, I think that it could be fraud. I mean, there could be stories like this that Buddhists were making up, right, to get money. I mean, this is a possibility that needs to be considered and to be ruled out. And given that the rainbow body is not in the original teaching of Buddhism, I mean, Gautama Sakyamuni didn't talk about rainbow body. This is something that came a bit later in the Buddhist tradition. And also, given the fact that there are cases of relics, of such cases that is being used to get money, right? So we have to be more critical than Ellison, I think, right? So there could be possible explanation of fraud in such cases. Now, I'm not saying that there are confirmed cases of fraud. I'm not saying that they are definitely fraud. I'm saying that whoever claims a miracle need to bear the burden of proof, right? So if you claim that the rainbow body is a miracle, then you need to bear the burden of proof to show that possible alternative hypotheses such as fraud can be ruled out, right? The person who proposed a miracle will need to rule out the alternative hypothesis. And in the case of this Simon Stylites and rainbow body, I mean, yeah, those people who claim that this is a miracle need to bear the burden of proof to rule out a possibility of fraud. And I'm not seeing any good reasons, right, to rule out a fraud in those cases. Whereas in the case of Jesus' resurrection, we have good reasons to rule out a fraud, right? As I said earlier on, we know that the earliest Christians were willing to sacrifice for their faith. So no groups of people will be willing to die for a fraud and to be punished by God in hell, right? The people won't be willing to do that. And so there's a context. So there's a context of persecution, right? In that case, in the case of the earliest Christians concerning the resurrection, which we don't find in Simon Stylites, which we don't find in the rainbow body. And that is a very important point, which Ellison failed to consider. And I think Paulogia, who played the clip from Ellison, right? Paulogia failed to consider that too. Okay, so, all right, next slide, please. Now, the fifth point, which I mentioned, is that Paul assumed responsibility for the tradition that he passed, and Paul cared about his reputation. with his audience in Corinth, and the cost of false confirmation would have been very high for Paul. So given which, Paul would have been very careful to make sure that he passed on what he knew is true, right? So Paul was evidently not a stranger to the Christians in Corinth. His correspondence with the Corinthians indicate that he cared about his reputation as an apostle to them. And moreover, Paul claimed that the tradition that Paul was passing on was what other apostles were preaching to as well, right? In 1 Corinthians verse 1 and verse 11, he says that, no, this is what we preach. Other apostles were also preaching this. And so this is a very powerful inference to indicate that Paul was preaching something which he and the Corinthians both knew were true. Now, Paulogia dismissed this by saying that, no, this is just an inference, right? He responded to my argument by saying that this is just an inference. But as I said earlier on, you cannot just dismiss an inference by saying that this is just an inference, right? This is a very good inference, which Paulogia shouldn't have just dismissed by saying that it's an inference. So next slide, please. The sixth consideration is that the Corinthians knew at least some, if not all, the eyewitnesses, right? So the letters of Paul indicate that Paul knew others. Right? So Paul is an eyewitness of the eyewitness, right? So Paul knew Peter, and Paul also knew James and other apostles whom he listed as eyewitnesses in 1 Corinthians 15, and he personally met them and talked with them, and he knew that the Corinthians knew them too. Okay, so Paul was addressing skeptics, and moreover, Paul was addressing skeptics, and he knew that his credentials were being critically assessed by people opposing him. So some among the Corinthians were evidently familiar with the teaching of Cephas, Peter, and they also knew who James was and was aware of other apostles, as indicated in the letters of Paul. Right, Paul was referring to people whom the Corinthians knew. So in other words, as a scholar Brian points out, the assertion of eyewitness testimony made both by Paul and the apostolic formula was easily open to challenge, unless, as must have been the case, he and the Corinthians knew perfectly well that it was correct, right? It was public knowledge that they know about, right? That they were these people who were claiming that they saw the resurrected Jesus, groups of people. Okay, so this must have been a fact that Paul was that Paul was reminding the Corinthians about in 1 Corinthians 15. Okay, now Paulogia has an analogy about Frank Zappa, which I find quite interesting. Can you play this clip, please?
No. The analogy would be, hi, Cameron, someone I won't identify told me that they heard that in 1995, in an unidentified city, 500 people, whose names I will not tell you, saw Frank Zappa perform, even though he died in 1993. If you don't believe me, go ask them. Where would you start? How would you check it, even if you wanted to?
Okay, so again, now here, Paul is assuming that 1 Corinthians 15, right, is all that is available to the Corinthians. But as I said earlier on, this is a false assumption, right? This is only the tip of the iceberg. And Paulogia makes a false analogy here because he added his own ideas into 1 Corinthians 15. Now, the fact that Paul did not name his source and the location on the names of the 500 to the Corinthians doesn't imply that he won't identify this to them, right? So remember, just now Paulogia says that I won't identify. He used an analogy of Frank Zappa, and he says I won't identify them to you. That's what Paulogia added in. That the phrase I won't identify is what Paulogia added in. Paul did not actually say that in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul did not say I won't identify, right? So this is something that Paulogia added in his own ideas based on his own assumption that 1 Corinthians 15 is all we have, is all the 1 Corinthians have, right? That is a false assumption, as I already said earlier on. It's only the tip of the iceberg. So, as I said in my previous interview, that when I tell my wife the kids are at home, look for them, without naming the address of home, does it mean that I won't identify this to her? Of course not. I don't need to tell her, since I'm referring to knowledge that's common to us, that's public to us. And I already said earlier on, Paul was appealing to public knowledge, as Craig Keener pointed out in his commentary. And Paul was writing in an appealing to Paul was writing in an appealing to public knowledge style, which he knew that the Corinthians would recognize and could easily falsify if it was not public knowledge. That is, the Corinthians were in a position to know whether Paul was conning them by citing something that they couldn't verify, and Paul knew that the cost of falsification would have been high. And thus, he wouldn't have claimed that it was public knowledge unless it was true, right? So this is an important point, which is totally missed by Paulogia's false analogy. Okay, next slide, please. Now, Paulogia also has something interesting to say about the American election, which he used as an analogy. So can you play the clip, please?
As of the time of this recording, 1/3 of Americans believe the 2020 election, held just a few months ago, was wrought with massive voter fraud that changed the results, while another third of Americans believe the election was entirely secure and accurate. No matter what the truth is, at least 1/3 of the most information-rich population in the history of the world is completely wrong about something highly investigatable and highly significant and important to them. That first-century Palestine, despite the handicaps of illiteracy, poor documentation, limited communication, proclivity for superstition, and relative immobility, was somehow magically immune from people believing false stories that could be checked, is laughable. You'll forgive me if I'm not yet convinced about this anonymous hand-me-down group appearance tradition.
Okay, so Paulogia refers to the American election, in which 1/3 of Americans believe that election was a fraud. Now, of course, others disagree. Now, in this case of the election, it may be more difficult to prove things one way or the other compared to Jesus' resurrection. Now, why do I say that? Because in the case of the election, now we are living in the modern society, it's very difficult to exclude, it's more difficult to exclude a fraud caused by people with motivations, right? Obviously, there will be some people who, there are some people who may be motivated to generate a fraud and having the modern technology to engineer it. Whereas such modern technology isn't available, right, in the first century. And therefore, some people may regard the investigative findings of the results of mail-in votes, for example, to be evidence of a fraud, while others dispute this by presenting evidence of reliability. And a number of Trump supporters have looked at the evidence and disagree with Trump, right? So there are supporters who remain, but the election results is not foundational to their support of Trump, and there's no persecution. So this is an important point, right? I mean, the election result is not foundational to their support for Trump. In fact, they supported Trump for other reasons, and that is why they would want the election results to show otherwise, right? So this is a very important difference compared to the case of the resurrection. Next slide, please. Whereas in the case of Jesus' resurrection, the truthfulness of the resurrection is foundational, right? That is the key difference. And verification with people proclaiming Jesus' resurrection would have been relatively straightforward compared to the election, right? Which is not so straightforward relatively, right? Relatively, I'm saying, compared to Jesus' resurrection. Even though I personally think that there's no fraud in the case of election, I like most Americans, I think that the election result is probably reliable, but that is another issue which I don't want to debate here. But I'm saying here that compared to the election, right, Jesus, the verifying whether there were people or no people claiming to have seen Jesus, that would have been more straightforward. Right? There's no modern technology that you can use, right, to create a fraud in that case. And moreover, as I said earlier on, right, the earliest Christians were highly mobile. Some of them would have traveled to Jerusalem every year for festival, and there was a well attested networking, right? So people could easily find out whether there were or there were not such people. And even though people in the first century, many of them will not know how to write, but they have good oral skills, right? And they know what checking out means, right? They to check out, they know what it means to check out orally. And the implication of 1 Corinthians 15 verse 6 is to check out. I already explained this earlier on. Rather than just to embrace the resurrection superstitiously. So Paul emphasized that if the resurrection did not happen, if it's not factually correct, then their faith is in vain. This is an anti-superstitious attitude, right? So Paulogia was saying earlier on, the first century people were superstitious, but Paul was presenting an anti-superstitious attitude here, right? He's saying that there's no point believing in Jesus if the resurrection is not factually correct. So this is anti-superstitious. This is anti-blind faith attitude, right? Is encouraging people to check out the evidence. And I already said early on, if there's no evidence, given the foundational nature of Paul's claim and the context of persecution, the Korean Christians will have left Christianity rather than preserving and honoring Paul's letters. Okay. All right, next slide, please. All right, my 7th point is that the other early documents also claim Jesus' resurrection and group appearances. So we not only have 1 Corinthians 15, but we also have first and early 2nd century documents, such as the 4 Gospels, Acts, other letters written by Paul writing to churches in various places, First Clement, Letters of Ignatius, etc. And this, as I said earlier on, this was written during the period of living memory, according to Marcus Bockmuir at Oxford University. Now, I mentioned this in my previous interview, and what did Paulogia has to say in response? Next slide. Okay, can you play this clip from Paulogia?
And 6th, that this 1 Corinthians passage is corroborated by other independent documents, particularly the Gospels.
You say here that you don't believe any of the Gospels, and of course, the church tradition is that Matthew and John were written by eyewitnesses. Mark and Luke, there's no one that are saying Mark and Luke are eyewitnesses. And you reject the traditional authorship of Matthew and John. So you say they're not written by eyewitnesses.
And indeed, such descriptions of their experience were indeed multiply attested, right? In first century documents. I mean, you find this in the Gospel of Luke, we find this in the Gospel of John, and also in Acts, right?
If you have a modern trial, what do you want to have from the witnesses? You don't want them to have post-event contact. You want to have truly independent witnesses. As far as I can tell, on the traditional theories of authorship, all these people are talking to each other all the time, so they're not truly independent in any way at all.
Okay, so my response is that there may be post-event contact, but the point here is that the different authors are not simply just copying from one another. Now, Edison was talking about the dependence of some gospel writers on another, but he was not denying that the Gospels have sources that are independent of 1 Corinthians 15. Okay, so if you read Edison's book, Resurrecting Jesus, page 239, Edison points out that the distance between 1 Corinthians 15 and the canonical accounts is often emphasized by scholars. So, for example, there's no mentioning of women in Paul's account, right? Whereas in the Gospels, it mentioned that the women were the first to see the resurrected Jesus in the Gospels, right? Whereas in 1 Corinthians, it mentions that Peter was the first to see the resurrected Jesus. So what this shows is that they came from different source, because if they come from the same source, it's very unlikely that the person who started the same source will contradict himself, right? By saying that the women were the first and then say that Peter were the first. So what this indicates is that there were more than one source here, and this is what Edison said. And Edison said that the sequential. So Edison is agreeing that 1 Corinthians 15 and the Gospels were multiple sources that are independent, right? So the point that he's making in the video clip is about the Gospels being dependent on the Gospels, but when it comes to the Gospels and 1 Corinthians 15, there is an independent tradition here, and this is what most scholars agree as well. Now, Edison also goes on to talk about the motive of repeating, and because this point is emphasized by Paulogia, because Lycona pointed out that there is a motive that is repeated, which is the physicality motive. Now, Allison says that, well, they may have some apologetic purpose, and Paulogia says that, well, no story is repeated by is repeated. But when we look at Allison says that the sequential similarities, the death, burial, resurrection, third day, appearance to individuals and appearance to 11 or 12 disciples, the outline, the motive of appearance to group, not just individuals, this motive is repeated. And remember, this is the key point of contention between me and Paulogia, right? How many people had the experience? Is it just two, or is it groups? So the main point of contention between me and Paulogia is not about the physicality motive, right? It's not about the contents of the experience, but rather how many people had the experience. And on this point, Allison actually agrees with me, right? Remember early on, I already showed that Allison believed that they were the 500. And not only that, no, Allison also agrees that this motive, the motive of groups of people, this motive is also multiply attested, right? It was repeated and repeated, right? So contrary to Paulogia. So this is an important point. Okay, so this point refutes Paulogia's hypothesis based on Allison.
We've Andrew's missing again. Well, hey guys, I hope you're really enjoying this today. People in the live chat are saying this is still going. Yeah, so this is this was kind of planned for a while to be a marathon stream. I'm looking to get into doing more of these. At least this week, I've got another marathon stream planned where we lay out more than 100. I think it's actually around 150 arguments for the existence of God, and that live stream is planned for this coming Thursday at 12 p.m. Central. So if that interests you, go check out the archives. I think you'll be interested in watching that. We've actually got a slide for each argument, followed by resources. We even got some quotes that we're going to do. We're also going to do some things to try to keep it fun and interesting, because I know that these marathon streams can get kind of monotonous, and they can get kind of long and seem like they're dragging on and on and on. So we're going to try to do things to kind of, break it up and make it interesting. I was hoping that Andrew would be back by this point, but I guess we'll just wait a little while longer. I'll just reiterate this. So if you haven't picked up Andrew's book, then do it. It's in the description of the video. Like I said, it's free. He worked out a deal with his publisher and his university to basically cover the cost, so that it's free on Kindle, and anyone can download it. Paulogia himself even downloaded it. So anybody who is interested in this kind of stuff and the resurrection and appearances, and whether or not there was only two, according to Paulogia, if you're interested in this kind of thing, then go pick up the free book. It's an amazing resource. Okay, so we're still waiting on Andrew. Hopefully he may be I don't know. Okay, he said, sorry, his computer crashed. Can I play the next clip? So, yes, I'm going to play the next clip, which is a clip from Allison talking about Mormonism. Actually, Andrew's joining. Here we go. All right, you're back. Or you may not be. There you are.
Crashed. Yeah. Okay.
No worries. I did get your text that you're ready to play the next clip. So let's go ahead and do that.
Okay, please do. Yeah. No, and of course, when we read the writings of skeptics, skeptics think that, well, these are all embellishment, right? They think that this is probably not true. Now, my response is that if this was not true, we can't experience how is it that they would come to the widespread agreement that Jesus was bodily resurrected.
Maybe if you would look at some other case at Mormonism, it would be helpful here. So I'm not a Mormon. I don't buy into the Mormon worldview, but when I try to explain early Mormonism, I have to explain several things. I have to explain Joseph's vision of the angel. I have to explain the golden tablets. I have to explain why an unlettered person could produce this book. I have to explain why 3 people swore they held the tablets, and what 8 others, saw them, and why this movement flourished even though, the odds were against it. So a Mormon would say, I think there's one explanation for all those things. God was with Joseph. He was a prophet. You could say God was with Joseph. He was a prophet. That explains all those things. Since I'm not a Mormon, I actually have 6 or 7 different explanations. It's a scattershot approach. I say, well, Joseph was of this character. This is how I explain the golden tablets, and so on and so on. So I don't think that's unreasonable.
Okay. Now, concerning Mormonism, I mean, the origin of Mormonism, there are various explanations, which are, as I said, whoever claims a miracle, I think there are various plausible explanations, and this has been explained by Sean McDowell in his interview with another scholar. And so, for example, Sean McDowell pointed out that the Mormons, do they actually claim that they actually exist physically? I mean, some scholars analyze and argue that the golden plates, it seems that is something that is to be seen by faith, by believing, and in order that you can see it. But this is different from the case of resurrection, where Paul claims that if the resurrection is not true, then your faith is in vain, right? So this is different, right? In the case of Mormonism, you have the faith before you can see the thing, whereas for resurrection case is that the resurrection must be true first in order for your faith to be valid. So this is quite different. And also, in the case of the golden plates, I mean, even if they are golden plates, right, that doesn't mean that it has a miraculous origin. I mean, it could be something that is a fraud. I mean, yeah. So we need to consider the fact that they could be golden plates, but there could be some other cause that explain why do these plates exist. I mean, some people could have created these plates. I mean, it doesn't require a miracle, right? I mean, Joseph Smith could have got problems from someone who made up these things. But in any case, I'm just giving some examples of possible theories, right, that the Mormons will need to exclude, right, before they can conclude that a miracle happened. And so the point here is that in any case, this does not excuse us from the need to consider the evidence, exclude the alternative explanations, including Paulogia's, and conclude that the resurrection did happen, right? So that's a conclusion. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the point that I'm making is that to come to the widespread agreement that Jesus was bodily resurrected. And this is a very important note, because bodily resurrection, right, refers to the dead body, right, coming to life again. And so it's not just merely sensing the presence of a dead person. Now, Paulogia often refers to bereavement experience, right? Bereavement experience is like somebody, when they are mourning, when their relative has died, they mourn for the dead person. They sometimes have this experience that the dead person, is that the presence of the dead person is around them. I feel it sometimes myself. My father passed away a few years ago. And sometimes it seems to me that my father is still around me. I had this kind of sense, right? The mourning, the bereavement experience. But this does not mean that I believe that my father was bodily resurrected. It doesn't mean that my father actually came out from his grave, and that he actually touched me with his physical hand. I mean, that is not the same thing, right? So this is an important point to note. I mean, if I really believe that my father is bodily resurrected, I would have grabbed his arms and pull him to show my mom, and then we'll have dinner together, right? And if I really believe that there's a bodily resurrection, right? But of course, I know that is not true. So the point here is that the early Christians, they couldn't have just have a bereavement experience as what Paulogia was claiming. Rather, they must have the experience of touching Jesus, meeting him together in group, right? In order that they could come to the widespread agreement that he was bodily resurrected. And this must have been prior to any apologetic purpose, which they may or may not have, right? For writing the accounts later on. So, Ellison keep on saying that, well, maybe the early Christians have apologetic agenda, and that's why, when they write the gospel and news with the disciples, and Ellison and Paulogia thinks that these are just make-up stories, right? Because they have apologetic agenda to make it seems as if Jesus was really resurrected. Now, my response, as I said earlier on, is that prior to any apologetic agenda, right, the disciples must have come to the widespread agreement that Jesus was bodily resurrected first, right, before they defend this, right, before they have any apologetic agenda for this. And how did they came to this widespread agreement in the first place? As I said earlier on, right, it couldn't have been just a kind of bereavement experience. Right? It must have been something solid, which they experienced as a group together, right, in order that they could be convinced in the first place, right, before they have any apologetic agenda to proclaim this. So this is the point, and it's a very important point that is not only emphasized by myself, it's also a point that is emphasized by N.T. Wright. Next slide, please. N.T. Wright, who is a well-known scholar of early Christianity, right? So in his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, he pointed out that all other messianic and it's not like other people. There were other people who claimed to be Messiah in around the first century. But after they were killed, none of their followers claimed that the messianic figure actually came back resurrected bodily, right? They all ended after the messianic figures were killed. Next slide, please. Next slide. And N.T. Wright explains the reason. He says, in no single case do we hear of the slightest mention of the disappointed followers claiming that their hero has been raised from the dead, because the early Christians knew better. Resurrection was not a private event. Resurrection is not a kind of bereavement experience that you experience privately in your own. Bodily resurrection, is supposed to be something that people can see and touch as a group, right? It's something physical. As I said, if my father comes to life again, I'll pull him to my mom, right? It's something that we can touch and see together. It's not something like a private event. And there's no wonder why no other groups of people claim that the messianic figures was bodily resurrected. It would have been implausible. Jewish revolutionaries, whose leader had been executed by the authorities and who managed to escape themselves, had only two options: give up the revolution or find another leader. Claiming that the original leader was alive was simply not an option, unless, of course, he was. Okay, next slide, please. So, Ellison, previous slide. Previous slide. A hypothetical story about how it would have seemed to people in the first century, right? If somebody ever claimed that another person rose from the dead, right? Other people will say that you must be out of your mind, right? Resurrect the. And the Jews believe that when a person died, he went to God's presence. And if you have a strong sense of God's love, God's presence, then if you just go and sing a song, don't just tell us that the other person is alive again. That would have been regarded as to be nonsense, right, by other early Jews. So the question is, how could the earliest Christians come to the widespread agreement that Jesus was bodily resurrected? As I said earlier on, right? There must have been some solid evidence, right? Which, such as what you find in the Gospels, of Jesus eating and drinking with the disciples. This must have been the case in the first place, before they even write the Gospels, right? In order that the disciples would come to the widespread agreement that Jesus was bodily resurrected. Now, next slide, please. Next slide. So,
Sorry, Andrew, your connection since you came back has been really poor. It's been cutting in and out a lot. I don't know if it'd be better for you to restart and come back, or what do you think?
Okay. Yeah. Can you play the next slide? I try to sort this out.
Play the next clip?
Yep, that's right.
Sure.
He can cook for them. He can eat. They can touch him, converse with him.
So yeah, there we disagree. I don't know what happened, and I find it all very mysterious, and I have no idea what Jesus's post-resurrection ontological, metaphysical, bodily status is.
Okay, so Paulogia cited Allison's objection, but as I said earlier on, just citing Allison's assertion that Allison just says I don't know, but just citing his assertion that I don't know doesn't answer my argument, right? It doesn't answer my argument that solid evidence would have been required in the first place, and I already explained why, right? So citing his assertion doesn't answer my argument that solid evidence would have been required in the first place in order to convince the earliest Christians that a resurrected body was what they witnessed rather than Jesus' ghost or spirits or whatever, right? Okay, next slide, please. So Allison also goes on to talks about memory being inaccurate. Yeah, can you play the next clip?
So I think apologists need to revisit this.
We have good reasons, right, to totally reject the intramental hypothesis, which is utterly ridiculous, and to conclude that the disciples must have experienced something real, right? It must be a real person. It must have been a real person whom they experienced alive.
You absolutely do not need to have external stimuli in order to have an experience, or the false memory of having had an experience.
Okay, so memory studies, and so he cited a psychologist called Loftus, and where Loftus talks about there are people who misremember things. Now, of course, we know that that can happen, but we all know that memories can be inaccurate, right? But that doesn't mean that all memories are inaccurate, right? It's not an all or nothing, right? So we must be very careful here not to commit the all or nothing fallacy, right? Yes, some memory can be inaccurate, but it doesn't mean that all is inaccurate. Now, so for example, we know that groups of eyewitnesses would have remembered the Holocaust, for example, right? Even if there are no photos. Now, sometimes people say, well, because we have photos of the Holocaust, that's why people remember. But even if there are no photos, those people who have ran through the Holocaust, who have suffered under the Germans, they would have remembered this. And even if some individuals may misremember some details, or even may implant some details, because Loftus talked about memory implantation. Loftus says that sometimes people can implant memories to make them think that or misremember some details, right? So yes, I mean, individuals may misremember some details, but surely we know that the Holocaust did happen, okay? So even if some people may misremember some details, and even if some people do misremember, others in the group can correct their false memories. And certainly they can correct those Holocaust deniers. I mean, we know that there are some people today who deny the Holocaust happened. It's a tiny minority of people. And this tiny minority of people claim that the photos of the Holocaust, for example, they claim that the photos were made up. And so the Holocaust deniers, so those people who actually, the eyewitness of Holocaust, right, they can refute the Holocaust deniers by what they remember, okay? So this is an important point. Now, the second point is that there's quite a lot of these analogies, right, between what happened. There are quite a number of these analogies between the memory studies and the case of Jesus' resurrection. Now, for example, Loftus talk about what happened to an individual. Okay, so an individual when he was 5 years old. Sometimes you ask me what happened when I was 5 years old. Yeah, there are things which I can't remember clearly, but this is compared to a tradition that's formulated soon after the event, the tradition of the resurrection, that is, and is being repeated often by communities, right, which will make sure that they remember the right thing. It's just like people remembering the Lord's Prayer, for example, right? So if I misremember the Lord's Prayer, other people in my church will correct me. Okay, so it's something that is repeated again and again, and so this is important. Okay, so this is a difference between those memory studies. They are disanalogous, right, to the case of the resurrection. And also, there's also other disanalogies. For example, Loftus mentioned individual hitchhiker was misidentifying a stranger as a rapist. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's quite. We find this happen, that people can misidentify danger to his disciples. So this is again another disanalogy. Now, by the way, Loftus herself doesn't use the memory studies to argue against the resurrection, right? Loftus herself doesn't do that, but it was Paulogia who cited Loftus, right, against the resurrection, and so I'm responding to Paulogia's citation of Loftus to argue that Paulogia is misusing Loftus' argument against the resurrection, because these are all false analogies. Okay, now next slide, please. Now, Paulogia claims that can you play the clip?
Now, the fact that Dr. Loke flagrantly disregards false memory as a potential factor when it comes to resurrection experiences is almost unforgivable, but made even worse when he bases the rest of his conclusion on the notion that he has made a comprehensive study of all potential naturalistic factors and can quantify them.
That I disregarded memory studies, right? But if you look at if you go to the find.
Sorry, Andrew, you're still kind of cutting in and out here. Andrew, are you there? All right, looks like we may have lost him again. All right, yeah, we did lose him. Sorry about that, guys. What is this, the 5th or 6th time? But maybe next time, I don't know where he's at. He could be at home. Last time we were recording, he was in a hotel. So who knows what's going on with all the COVID stuff. So what I can do is ask you guys to comment below, because this is very unusual for us to have a stream this long. So comment below if you've enjoyed this really long stream, or if you've enjoyed this kind of like marathon stream where it's just like, yeah, it's just really, really long.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so okay, guys, sorry about that. Actually, what happened this time is that my software crashed. So everything that could go wrong in this stream has basically gone wrong. I'm actually going to test. Okay, here he is. Let's see if Andrew can come in now. Yeah, now it's saying error starting interview session, which is great. So he may not be able to even join us again. We'll see what we can do. Hopefully he'll try again and we can finish this out, because this last part I think is pretty important. So we'll see if we can get him. All right, here we go. Let's try it again. There he is. All right, it worked.
Okay, can you play? Yeah, can you play the clip about Paulogia accusing me of disregarding memory studies?
Sure. Yeah, I played it, but maybe you didn't hear it. So I'll do it one more time.
Okay, that's fine. Then you don't need to play it. Okay, then I will just go on and respond right to that. Now,
okay.
So actually, it is not true. I mean, I did not disregard memory studies. In fact, I discuss it in chapter 7 of my book. Now, can you show my book on the screen for others to see?
Yes. All right, let's do that now. Here we go. All right, it is up.
Okay, can you go to that page I mentioned to you earlier on? I think it's page 151.
Yeah, I've got it up.
Okay. Yeah, so if you look at page 151, if you look at the highlighted words, right, you will find that I discuss memory distortion in my book. And you can just scroll down a few pages, right? You will see that I considered the memory distortion hypothesis and I responded, right, to the hypothesis. So, for example, I pointed out, that there's a lot of false analogies, right, that's used in this kind of objections, which I already mentioned earlier on, right? So, what I mentioned earlier on, right, are some of the things which I mentioned in my book as well. Similar arguments, right, found in my book, and I also presented other arguments to refute the false memory hypothesis. So I don't have time to go through all this in detail because we already talked for a long time. But I just want to highlight the point here is that Paulogia misrepresented me again, right? He claimed that I disregarded false memory hypothesis, when the fact is that I did not disregard false memory hypothesis, right? I actually considered it and refuted it in my book. So Paulogia has flagrantly disregarded my book. He misrepresented it again. Now, Paulogia ended by saying that he wanted to debunk bad arguments, and I will say that I also want to do the same. And in fact, if he wanted to continue the discussion with me, I would suggest that instead of him making another video and quoting me out of context, misrepresenting me and other scholars again, I would suggest that why not we have a written debate? Okay. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that there are reasons why I do not wish to have an oral debate with him, because I have a policy which states that I'm not willing to have, I don't want to have a oral debate with somebody who doesn't have a PhD. And one of the reasons is because I mentioned in my document that the people without PhD tend to make more mistakes compared to people with PhD. Now, I'm not saying that people without PhD can't give good arguments. I'm not saying that, right? I'm not saying that people with PhD don't make mistakes, but I'm saying that there's a general tendency, and Paulogia certainly fit into that category, right? As we have seen in this video, in this discussion, he has misrepresented scholars again and again and again, right? So during oral debates, right, it's very hard to fact check, right? I mean, making all these slides took me a lot of time, right? To check out the sources, to check out the original videos, to compare the original video with his video, right? So it took me a lot of time to fact check the sources and to document his errors one by one. And we simply cannot do that in a public on the spot oral debates, right? We cannot fact check a lot of things on the spot, and so it will not be wise, to have an oral debate with someone like Paulogia, right, who misrepresents scholars again and again. Right, so I think the best way to continue our discussion is to have a written debate where we can take our time, right, to fact check, right, to make sure that we quoted accurately, right, to make sure that our facts are accurate, right, and to present accurate arguments. I think that will be the best way to continue. So, Paulogia, if you are listening to this, I'm inviting you, right, to a written debate, right? Inviting you to it. So please let me know whether you're willing or not, right? You can easily find my email on the internet, right? By going to HK, Hong Kong Baptist University website, you can easily find my email address, or you can contact Cameron, who has my contact, right? So we can easily get in touch with each other. So Paulogia, if you're interested to continue the conversation with me, instead of making more videos, why not we have a written discussion or debate? Okay, so that's an invitation to you. All right, so let me just summarize what we have discussed over the last 3 hours. I'm sorry I have taken such a long time, and I'm so sorry about my laptop. I think I need to change a new one. So let me just briefly summarize. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so here is a list of errors which I've identified, right, in Paulogia's arguments. So firstly, a failure to consider how finding ancient non-Christian sources and may be difficult under certain circumstances, and failure to recognize that written first-hand source may be the tip of the iceberg and need to consider other considerations, and failure to recognize that inference based on considerations is a valid way to determine the truthfulness of an account, and it is more foundational and can be highly reliable, right? So Paulogia failed to consider these important points. And then Paulogia misinterprets various sources, right? So, for example, he misinterpreted 1 Corinthians 15, verse 6. He thought that this is Paul was just passing on an invitation when it was Paul's own invitation to check out the eyewitness. And Paulogia also failed to recognize the epistemological standard, which is to check out the eyewitness themselves. And he make false analogies, right? Frank Zappa, American election, all these are false analogies. He missed the point of my argument concerning what would be required to generate a widespread agreement of bodily resurrection in the first place. And next slide. And Paulogia misrepresented me and other scholars again and again, right? So he misrepresented my book, making it seem as if misrepresented concerning 1 Corinthians 15:12, misrepresented my talk by quoting me out of context concerning the early Christians' willingness to die, misrepresented Sean and myself by pitting us against each other when we both agree against him, that the critical point was their willingness, the early disciples' willingness to die, which can be established, and misrepresented Sean by deceptive cutting and pasting, making it seem as if there were only evidence for two, but when there was actually 6 who actually did die for their faith. Next slide. And then he misrepresented Ellison by deceptive cutting and pasting, when Ellison actually thinks that there were indeed groups of people who have, including there were indeed the 500 who actually experienced something. And he misrepresented Lycona, misinterpreted 1 Corinthians 15, verse 6 by, and he also misrepresented my book by claiming that I disregarded false memory. So in conclusion, Paulogia's video they are high in quality in terms of creativity, right? But they are, in terms of content, is extremely low quality, is misleading, deceptive. And the hypothesis that he's presenting, right, is pseudo history. As I said, is a fringe theory. No scholar, as I know, hold to this view. Even if there might be only one or two. Right? It is a fringe theory. It's based on multiple errors of reasoning, fallacies of reasoning, and misrepresentations, and therefore it ought to be rejected. Right? Okay. So are there any time for Q&A, or we already talked long time? And
I think we're going over time now. So we probably need to go ahead and close it out.
Okay, sure. So let me just go on and presenting the closing, right? So in summary, I have not only refuted Paulogia's theory, but I have also established the conclusion, right, which is accepted by most scholars, which is that there were groups of people who had the experience. And I base it on 8 considerations and inference, right? I have argued that people would check and people could check, and Paul was responsible and cared for his reputation, for his audience in Corinth, and he knew that the Corinthians knew some of these eyewitnesses, right? So Paul was passing on. Paul was an eyewitness to the eyewitness, right? And he passed on information which is public knowledge to himself and his audience, which indicated there were indeed these groups of people who claim to have the experience. And as I already argued in my previous interview with you, Cameron, that these people who claim to have experience did indeed have the experience, right? I already explained the reasons for why that is so, right, in the previous interview. And therefore, and I also argued, moreover, today that they must have some kind of experience in the first place, right? They must have some kind of solid experience in the first place, involving groups of people, right, in the first place, before they could have come to the widespread agreement that Jesus was indeed bodily resurrected. And we have multiple early documents, right, including multiple attestation for group appearances as well. So given all this evidence, it is no wonder, next slide please, it's no wonder that scholars such as Thiessen and Mertz, they conclude that there is no doubt the appearances listed in 1 Corinthians 15, right, that there's no doubt that they came from people who attest an overwhelming experience, right? So there were indeed the 12. There were indeed the 500 who attest an overwhelming experience, who did experience something and attested to it. And so the historical evidence indicate that there were indeed groups of people who claimed that they have seen Jesus alive after his crucifixion, and they truly saw something. And as I've already argued in my previous interview with you, and also in my book, that what they saw was not something that's caused intramentally, but extramentally. And this extramental entity is not anything else but Jesus himself, and it's the same Jesus who died on the cross and was seen alive again, and therefore Jesus resurrected. Right. So this is a conclusion that is well established on the basis of the historical evidence.
Okay, I think that is where we're going to draw it to a close. I'm really happy that at least in this last section, it looks like everything is running smooth and no technical issues. But yeah, thanks for coming on. This has been, like I said, this is a marathon episode. I mean, we're at what, 3 and I don't even know how long. It's a long episode, but I was seeing that people in the live chat were saying that they really enjoy this kind of format. So they were really interested in. I mean, some people we were saying go an hour longer. So this has been great, and I'm really happy to do some more.
I'm too tired to go on now. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, right.
Exhausted now. Yeah.
Right, and it's what 1 a.m. over there. I think past 1 a.m.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
You're at.
Yeah,
so
me
you're,
and my
ready to get
my laptop
sleep.
is exhausted. I'm exhausted too. So we are both crashing towards the end. I'm so sorry.
No
I
worries.
hope this has been helpful for people. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would love to do your book on the teleological argument. I would love to have, say, like you and Luca Barnes on together. That'd be really fun to do something like that.
Yeah,
so that'd be cool. All right, well, that's going to do it for us. Thank you guys for tuning in today, and until the next Capturing Christianity stream, which will be this Thursday, where we present over 100 arguments for the existence of God. We will see you guys later. See ya.